When people came to the execution, they believed that the Empress was standing there, the woman who was deposed because of treason. This is Eveina de Aradel. The rumors didn't bother me. She really is a witch, judging by the color of her hair. Such a dark hair color does not exist, so they thought so. Her life was truly miserable. She was born in the Arga Empire, to the family of Count Aradel. Their family had quite a bit of power among the aristocracy. But all this did not mean much to her. Her father was very partial to women, so he acquired a decent number of bastards, and she was 19 of them. I got my appearance from my mother, except for the color of my eyes. Because of this, the Countess hated her. She lived her whole life as an unhappy, fragile child. But real horror awaited her after meeting him. The gentleman ordered her to greet the guy before her was His Highness the Prince. He appeared suddenly. The other children tried their best to get his attention. Only Eveina was afraid of him, so she tried to avoid meeting him and not to catch his eye again. But of all the Count's daughters, he took Eveina. She was 12 years old at the time, and he chose her as crown princess. Her father, who was thirsty for power, was only glad that after the man he wanted to see as emperor, his blood and flesh would be holy. So he immediately agreed, and a few years later she became Empress. After that, her father tried to make the emperor his puppet, but he was much smarter than her father. In 5 years, he strengthened his power, thereby driving the aristocratic party into a corner. And if it had ended there, he would have used her born into a family of aristocrats flawlessly. And very insidiously, unexpectedly, rumors began to spread that Eveina was taking over all the wealth from the treasury. She was accused of being responsible for the miscarriage of the emperor's mistress. She was always called a dark witch. It was invented by people themselves. One day, her father handed her a sandwich and asked her to take it. The girl took it in her hands and asked what it was. Father replied that it was me, and she asked again if he was really asking her to poison the emperor, and seemed to think that she would fall for this point. She said she had had enough, so her father got angry and started yelling at her. He started shouting to Eveina that the emperor had no intention of leaving them alive from the start, so they had to attack first. After this, a knight entered the room and ordered everyone to kneel, and the girl became frightened and began to believe that the emperor could hear all this. The gentleman turned to Count Aradel and said that if he would behave quietly, he promised to do everything quickly. The emperor swung his sword at him, and finally the count shouted that he was not a noble bastard. It seems the emperor has forgotten how the count helped him become emperor, and so he thanks him like this. The count asked again if he really thought he was destined to die so easily. He grabbed his daughter and tried to cover himself with her, but the emperor accidentally hit her. The knight was immediately pursued because the count began to run away. The servants were ordered to catch him sharply. The emperor approached the girl and tried to take the bottle of poison. He told Eveina not to worry because they would definitely catch her father. He was shocked that the count decided to hide behind his daughter, and he thought it was some kind of disgrace. He said that it was all thanks to her because she was his empress. In the end, the emperor won the victory, and all who spoke out against him were executed. The Aradel family was the stewards of the earth, and when they died, they cried out that it was all because of Evelyn. They called her names and shouted that she was a creature that brought trouble. They started shouting that she should never have been born. And at the end of this mortally long and boring life, the money for her execution is on the table. The gentleman began to read that the Empress had been overthrown and therefore executed. The death of the fallen ruler, Eveina de Aradel. After which the gentleman, who is the coachman, asked the lady to be more careful. It happened at night, so it was quite dark. The gentleman said that she could go out now. He called her by her correct name, but the lady stopped him. She said that this woman was already dead, and her name was now Anastasia. After this, another gentleman turned to Anastasia and said that he wanted to know where she would like to go. The lady remained silent at first, but then after thinking decided to answer. She said with a smile that she would go anywhere as long as she was away from this city. She had already begun to think that this was all just a dream. She thought she heard the emperor addressing her, so she turned to him. Anastasia was simply shocked when she heard that he knew that she had survived. She didn't want to believe her eyes. Casa and Gray lay dead at the emperor's feet. The emperor noticed that he had new toys. He pulled out his snake tongue and noted that it was all thanks to Empress Anastasia, after which he said that he thought it was time for her to go to the next world. He also said that everything should be as it was intended from the beginning. The girl was simply horrified and could not believe what was happening now. She said that she didn't agree with this, after which she finally woke up. This is a damn prophetic dream. Similar nightmares have haunted Anastasia since early childhood. Although Anastasia could not see the future she wanted for herself, this skill sometimes helped her out. Thus, she knew in advance that she was destined to become Empress and die on the chopping block. However, she was unable to change what was destined. Only after meeting death as a deposed empress was Anastasia able to find freedom, all thanks to the doll that the alchemist created for her. Then she stopped in the Terran Empire, which is at odds with Arga, and became the owner of the largest trade guild Chaos. Since then, 5 years have passed. To her misfortune, the emperor continues to appear to her in her dreams, and this prophetic dream reminds her that this is not the end. But now, Anastasia is no longer that powerless empress. Anastasia has the strength to fight this, so she decided that she would protect everyone, even if it meant putting her own life on the line. A year ago, meeting with Duke Itan, he noticed that the owner of the trade guild was a woman. This was the guild that everyone was so desperate to get. He asked again if her name was really Anastasia. The lady confirmed it. This duke was a special person. There has never been a duke in his family who was not skilled in the art of the sword. The thing is that the duchy has been raising swordsmen from generation to generation, and their abilities are the guarantee of Anastasia's protection. So she needs the duke. The gentleman asked how she could help him resolve the land issue. He had already contacted other guilds, but no one had been able to do this for him. Anastasia noted that she had not had any failures so far. Anastasia also heard that the duke swore in the name of the duke that he would do anything if the weather issue on his lands was resolved. The gentleman replied that everything was exactly like that. Therefore, Anastasia said that she would believe his words. She also provided her terms if their deal ended on a good note. The duke said that if she failed after this, he swears in the duke's name that he will not leave her alone. Anastasia smiled and noted that they would not disappoint him. It was a bold statement, so the gentleman hoped that these were not just words. The lady told the duke that chaos never throws words to the wind. He would soon see for himself. Otherwise, they wouldn't have become the best guild on the continent. In the north, one always has to contend with severe cold. Until now, no one has dared to declare a solution to this problem. So the butler decided to ask again if the master thought they could handle it. The duke noted that since Anastasia said so, then that's how it would be. Almost a year has passed since the meeting with Duke Itan. The construction was almost finished. Someone knocked on the lady's door, and she allowed entry. The servant informed Lady Anastasia that a man from Duke Itan's estate had arrived, and he conveyed that the promise would be kept. It turns out that now it is Anastasia's turn to receive gifts. She finally caught Duke Itan. It seems she had another prophetic dream, but Anastasia had no idea where she was. It looked like a battlefield. She heard voices, so she looked around to see who was there. There, she saw a young gentleman with dark hair. He started attacking men, and blood was flowing before her eyes. This man dealt with all the knights single-handedly. Judging by his look, this is a normal action for him. He looks as if nothing happened. But suddenly the place changed. She saw a light, after which I saw a naked guy in a towel, but only his back was visible. Still, she didn't understand what it meant. This sight made Anastasia feel embarrassed. She didn't understand if this was really a dream, and why she was dreaming about it at all. She really wanted to open her eyes to wake up in the real world. Then this guy turned to her. Anastasia was still trying to do something to wake up, but she also realized that this was the same man from the battlefield, and he was now looking straight at Anastasia. After this, Anastasia finally woke up. She sighed and did not understand what kind of dream it was. She wondered if he was prophetic or just her imagination. It may simply be a matter of her unmet needs. However, there is no point in thinking about it because this man continued to appear to her in her dreams. When her fear of the emperor plunged her into the depths, this mysterious man appeared. When she looked into the eyes of this man, who seemed to be afraid of nothing in this world, she felt as if she was behind a stone wall. On days like these, Anastasia could sleep peacefully without thinking about anything. A man with dark eyes and hair, Anastasia would really like to know who he is. In the guild, the Chaos Master turned to Mistress Anastasia. He said that if she kept staring at the documents, nothing would change. She also asked why Itan died. The gentleman said it was all due to old age. He died just a week before the contract was to be executed. She was a little surprised because she hadn't seen it in her dream. Anastasia was also angry that those damn dreams didn't warn her about his death. And so it always is. Anastasia nevertheless decided to find out how things were with the heir. The man said that he seemed to have gone to seek the emperor's blessing. However, the informant was unable to obtain information about him. It's as if this person doesn't exist. The lady said that this is a line of swordmasters. Anastasia told no one to come near him because it was dangerous, after which she turned to Gray and asked how old the man who would become the next duke was. The man replied that he was 30 years old. The lady also asked how likely it was that he preferred men. Gray replied that the probability was 0. Then Anastasia decided to ask what the probability was that he was not interested in women in general. Gray didn't know this because they didn't find any information about it. It's hard to say anything yet. The lady remained silent at first, but then said that in that case, she would go there. North Duchy of Itan. The Tojo party requests an audience with his lordship. They've been getting on his nerves lately. The gentleman also asked about the rats in the estate. The butler replied that everyone had been caught, and so the gentleman asked again if they had found out who was behind it. Unfortunately, it has not been confirmed, yet it looks like they belong to the aristocratic Tuhu party. The capital side of Duke Dean is also suspicious, and yet he insisted to the very end that they were approaching the Duke's bathroom. The guy was surprised, but didn't show it, after which the butler asked the gentleman again what they were going to do. The gentleman calmly replied that he knew it himself. Then the butler said that he understood him and bowed to him. After which, the gentleman turned to Jack when he had almost left the room. He said that people from the Chaos Trade Guild had arrived here. Jack was surprised and asked again if he had understood his master correctly. The gentleman, meanwhile, simply asked the butler to call them to him. The butler greeted the lady and her servants and was glad to see them. The man apologized for not warning them about his visit. The butler said that everything was fine and that they were already expected. At first, the gentleman was surprised, but when they entered, he didn't show it. The butler noticed with attention that these three had obviously not been introduced before, and this immediately caught his attention. He could not help but notice that they looked unusual. He said in a reserved tone that the new Duke Cain von Itan was now standing before them. His words immediately caught the attention of everyone present, as this was an important announcement. The lady was shocked, not believing her eyes. She could not believe that this was really the young man who had appeared in her dreams so many times. It seemed unreal. She remembered him clearly from her dreams, and now he was standing in front of her. It was the same guy, and it seemed he really was the new Duke, as the butler had said. The gentleman greeted his lordship, Duke Itan. He introduced himself as Gray Reed. This man is the leader of the Chaos Guild. The lady, meanwhile, was in shock. This man was looking at her and not at Gray. The man offered his condolences to him, but the Duke demanded that he speak more to the point. The lady smiled and took off her robe. He seemed to know that she was the head of the guild and asked for forgiveness. She asked permission to introduce herself and said that she was, in fact, the head of the guild. Then the gentleman asked her what she wanted. Then the lady said that they had not made a deal with the late Duke. And according to this deal, if his problem is solved, she will receive his protection. As she promised, she did her part. However, the Duke died suddenly, so she wants him to fulfill his obligations. The gentleman said that he agreed. The girl was surprised that he agreed so quickly. He noted that she would become his ward to me and his mistress. Anastasia was in complete shock and even opened her mouth at his words. She began to believe that he was going to use her as a shield against Tohu. She noted that this is a countermeasure against any opportunities and troubles. For example, the potential bride. The Duke then noted that she was really smart. The girl also said that she had already fulfilled her part of the contract. Now it was his turn, and she also asked why he decided that it would agree to such conditions. The Duke replied that it was all because of this, that she had no choice at all. Anastasia said that she is the head of the Chaos Guild, and it seems that he thinks that there is something that she cannot do. The Duke asked why the head of such a powerful guild was revealing his true appearance, hoping to get Duke Itan. This man doesn't look like he's just taken over the position of Duke. It is a pity that it was not possible to obtain information in advance, and all that remains is to fight. She approached his lordship and said that in a case where the contract price had already been paid, putting forward new conditions would call into question trust. She asked where the guarantee was that new conditions would not emerge. The Duke said that this was interesting and asked what she was proposing. Anastasia heard that a contract concluded at the temple is no different from an oath, and he puts his life on the console until the terms of the contract are fulfilled, and the heart of the one who violates it will be torn apart by divine power. The lady noted that there really was no more perfect contract than this. Therefore, she would like to know if he agrees to conclude it. The gentleman said that he agreed, and since the lady had already fulfilled her conditions, she would be asked to make new ones, and she would like to equally adjust her part. She asked if his lordship wished to share his bed with her. Does she want to give it up? Anastasia said that she wants to give it up. She doesn't want to sleep with him, but if everything is mutual, and only if necessary, then she agrees. Then she asked again if they accepted these conditions, and the Duke said that he of course agreed, but he asked about something else. He asked what would happen if she was the first to ask for it. The girl said that of course it was not for nothing that they called him the Duke of Earthly Beauty, but everyone had different tastes. The lady said not to worry, because she would not cross that line. Then the Duke said that this was indeed a bold statement, and he was not sure that one could control one's attraction. Anastasia said that she gained experience in this. She had been to the other side, but the Duke did not understand what she was talking about. The lady said she was simply referring to divorce. There would be nothing on her part that could jeopardize their contract, because she doesn't need any problems at all. Now she needs to sign the contract. It seems like she really wants this contract, but it is better not to betray the Duke, unless, of course, her life is dear to her. After that, he signed the contract. The lady said that she of course agreed with him. She also said at parting that she would eagerly await a response from the temple. The gentleman told her that he understood her perfectly, after which she decided to take her leave. But the Duke said that he wanted to ask something else, and Madame Anastasia turned to him. She was surprised that there was anything else of interest about the contract. The Duke, meanwhile, asked if she was a voyeur. The lady was simply shocked. The gentleman said that he would consider this as an answer, but she didn't even say anything. He didn't even hear footsteps. Someone approached him so quietly that the air didn't move. Not a rustle, not a shadow on the floor, not the slightest movement to betray their presence. But he knew one thing for sure. It was a woman. The invisible presence, the light almost elusive aroma, everything pointed to it. And this woman was not just a random person, but the guild leader herself. While they were talking, he tested her, trying to use his energy, but he came across emptiness, as if she was not a person in front of him. It certainly wasn't a defensive spell, since even the most powerful barriers left barely visible traces. That meant she could somehow suppress magic or hide her own powers. But that seemed impossible. If she really was blocking his abilities, then it would be hard to call her an ordinary person. There simply weren't any people like her. Moreover, if she had such incredible power, she would have no reason to agree to this contract. She was clearly afraid of him. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were burning with the will to live. She led a guild that could provide him with anything he wanted. So what could such a woman be afraid of? What made her look like she was walking on the edge of an abyss? He turned to Jack, suggesting that the woman was the daughter of a baron who had long since fallen from grace. The servant reported that according to their information, this was indeed the case. At first glance, the information matched, but something about this woman did not give the Duke peace. So he ordered Jack to check everything again, this time to dig deeper, to find out what might have remained in the shadows. The butler asked whether the gentleman wanted the investigation to start from scratch, from the very beginning. The Duke raised an eyebrow in surprise and replied that he was amazed that Jack dared to answer a question with a question. Realizing his mistake, the butler apologized, bowed his head, and without hesitation, turned around to get down to business immediately. When he left, the Duke remembered that woman again. She was a riddle, a secret that he wanted to solve. Her bold, unexpected offer to share his bed came into his head. He remembered her face at that moment. The corners of his lips twitched into a smile. Now he wanted to know even more what was hidden behind this mask. Anastasia was confused when they started accusing her of lying. She tried to prove that she was seeing this man for the first time in her life, but her voice betrayed her. The situation was tense, and the more persistently she denied her involvement, the more it seemed that she was hiding something. The gentleman, observing her reaction, immediately noticed a change in her behavior. She became especially agitated when the conversation turned to voyeurism. He chuckled and concluded that she clearly had something to hide, even if she tried to deny it. But who gave him the right to judge her anyway? This man couldn't even curb the Duke himself, and now he was trying to teach her a lesson. Anastasia was outraged by his behavior, but there was no point in arguing with him. In response, he merely shrugged his shoulders and, with an indifferent smile, stated that he was just a mercenary, not a sword master. Therefore, he was not capable of trying to put the Duke in his place, and he did not want to die because of stupidity. Gray, not hiding his concern, turned to the lady. He quietly noted that the Duke's family was shrouded in secrets that no one dared to speak about out loud. Even the servants in their house preferred not to discuss the affairs of their masters. The only thing that was known for sure was that all the men in their family were outstanding swordsmen. This skill was passed down from generation to generation, making them formidable and dangerous opponents. However, the women who became their wives rarely enjoyed a happy and serene life. The fates of these ladies were not easy, and each of them faced difficulties about which there were dark rumors. Even though the Duke was sweating from his workout, he still looked incredibly attractive. There was something captivating about his appearance, even though the years had not passed him by. But despite his attractiveness, he never showed interest in women. That is why the Duke did not worry about his reputation. He simply did not care what others thought of him. As for the new Duke, his appearance was questionable. However, it would be extremely tactless to say this out loud, but it seems that the lady has already managed to make this mistake. Anastasia turned away and thought, how did it happen that she actually said something like that? She didn't expect to trust them so much, and it scared her a little. However, no matter how hard she tried to hide it, she was still concerned about this relationship. She understood this man's feelings perfectly, even if she could not share them completely. She needs him, and she has no choice. Even if he is a dangerous ally, she cannot do without him. Gray confidently stated that although their guild is inferior to the Duke in strength, they are capable of subjugating his army if they play their cards right. Emperor Arga is their enemy, and fighting him may be hopeless. If they are defeated, not only will their lives be in danger, but the guild's status will also collapse. Then other countries will no longer take them seriously. They cannot afford to destroy an entire empire. It is too risky. The lady speaks of threats, and there is firmness in her voice. They must be careful because one mistake could cost them everything. She has no right to endanger her people. These people trust her, follow her, and therefore she has a duty to protect them. They should not suffer because of her past, no matter how dark it is. Gray noted that even despite this, one must not let one's guard down. Perhaps the enemy is already close. One must be prepared for anything, because betrayal can come from where one least expects it. When the butler invited them, his words were strange. He spoke as if he already knew that they were coming. It couldn't be a coincidence. How could he have known about them in advance? He immediately announced that they were expected. This meant one thing. The Duke had information about her. Perhaps he even suspected who she really was. This was an alarming sign. Now their informants will have to be even more attentive. Any little thing can be important. The enemy is watching, which means they need to watch their every move. However, the lady did not share this anxiety. She did not think it necessary to change anything. If her identity was revealed, so be it. She did not intend to hide any longer. Gray was shocked by her words. He tried to say something, but he understood that her decision was final. She was not afraid of the consequences. The lady calmly stated that the Duke would hardly be too concerned about this. Everything secret becomes clear one day, and she had long been prepared for this. The only thing that really bothered her was how he recognized her. Maybe the events she thought were a dream were real. Maybe it wasn't just a vision. It's possible that she was actually watching real events unfold at that very moment. And if so, things are much more complicated than she thought. Gray looked at Anastasia with slight concern and carefully asked if something was bothering her. He had long been able to read her mood and saw that she was thoughtful. Anastasia quickly replied that everything was fine, but she continued to think if it was him she dreamed about, then perhaps it was a sign that she was on the right path. In novels, such things are called fate, when signs lead to the only correct decision. But in reality, everything is not so simple. The man sitting next to her shook his head in bewilderment, not understanding how the lady could even agree to something like this. Another participant in the conversation thoughtfully noted that perhaps she was lacking something since she went along with it. After all, if a woman decides to become the Duke's mistress, it means she has a good reason for it. Anastasia calmly asked not to jump to conclusions, because she simply had no choice in this situation. The men looked at each other, not understanding what she meant, because in their opinion, if a person is a master of the sword, then he can stand up for himself. They thought that if the Duke simply did not suit the lady, it would still be understandable, especially since she has money, and her appearance is quite remarkable. Their words made Anastasia feel awkward. These conversations were unpleasant, but she remained unperturbed. However, some were sure that no matter how good the swordmaster was, even 100 fighters would not save in such a situation. Suddenly, Anastasia slammed her hand on the table, cutting off the discussion. She firmly declared that she had had enough of this empty talk. The meeting was over for today because there was simply nothing further to discuss. Obviously, it would not be easy to convince those present, but there was no point in arguing with them now. Standing up, Anastasia headed towards the exit and instructed Gray to finish all the remaining business before leaving the room. Anastasia knew that Gray was having a hard time. He had always been a reliable assistant, but now the situation was simply catastrophic. These people did not understand how to work with them, and Gray had to deal with everything alone, maintaining order. He believed that with time, they would figure it out and understand everything. But maybe they shouldn't have behaved like this, causing even more questions and tension. They needed to calm down and focus on the main thing, and not create new problems. The men began to whisper among themselves, worried about what was happening. They were worried about what would happen next and how it would all end. They couldn't just stand by and wait, not knowing where it was all going. Gray, noticing their doubts, asked what exactly they didn't understand about the mistress's actions. He didn't understand why they doubted, because Anastasia always acted in their interests. Hadn't she already proven it more than once? However, there were those among them who were not entirely sure. Was she really doing all this for them? Or did she have another goal that they did not know about? Mistrust, although weak, was still in the air. Then one of the men spoke up, mentioning that he had heard rumors. It was said that the aristocracy of Arga had recently begun to take action. Perhaps this had something to do with what was happening now. To be more precise, the emperor himself intervened. They could not say exactly what he had in mind, but it was clear that something was changing, and events were indeed unfolding, exactly as they had expected. Gray nodded, confirming their guess. Yes, Quan was observant and noticed something important. The lady really said that it was necessary, so all they had to do was watch the developments. If Anastasia decided that this was the way to go, then they had no choice but to accept it. They could only watch her actions and trust her, as they had done before. In addition, several years ago, they had experienced a terrible famine. This time left a deep mark on them. They remembered what it was like to be left without food and without hope for tomorrow. One of the men recalled how he himself had to leave his family to survive. It was a difficult decision, but he had no other choice. Then he realized how cruel this world is. Without Anastasia, they wouldn't have what they have now. It was she who helped them get back on their feet, survive, and find a purpose. Without her, their fate would have been completely different, and they understood it perfectly well. That's why they made a vow that day. They vowed that if she helped them survive, they would give her their loyalty. That moment changed their lives. They swore to serve her and follow her to the end. If she could help them solve their problems, they would dedicate their lives to her, because Anastasia had already done too much for them to betray her trust. The guy looked at her carefully and noticed that this whole situation seemed strange to him. No matter how he looked at it, he didn't understand what could have charmed the Duke so much. Anastasia frowned when she heard his words and asked him again what exactly he was talking about. The guy shrugged and said that he himself did not know what could have attracted the attention of such a person, especially when it comes to the Duke himself. Anastasia thought about it and asked if she really looked so pathetic in his eyes that it could arouse pity or interest. She tried to understand the reasons for his words, but he only smirked and said that it was not worth thinking about. It was better to just forget and not rack your brains over it. Even when she openly declared that no one was obliged to stay by her side and that everyone could live as they wanted, no one left. They continued to remain under her command. The reason was obvious. They all liked being around her. Everyone who stayed owed her something. She saved them, gave them a new life, and they couldn't just leave, including him. That's why she should remember this and not doubt the loyalty of those around her. They are here, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. Without her, he simply would not have survived. This fact was obvious to him. He understood that he owed her everything, and these were not just beautiful words, but the truth. So he made the decision that he would stay by her side and be her sword, her protection, her weapon. He had no doubts about his choice, and he was not going to back down. It was up to her to decide whether to sheathe the sword or use it. He would follow her, regardless of her decision, because he considered her worthy. She, hearing this, calmly replied that there was no need for that. He didn't have to fight for her. It was enough to just stay close and be who he was. And Duke Itan will be her shield. The guy was surprised to hear this and quietly asked if the lady really believed in him and his loyalty so much. She answered simply, and without a shadow of a doubt. She simply had no other choice. The Rubicon has already been crossed, and there is no turning back. Only those who do not give up today, who can withstand all the trials and endure to the end, will see tomorrow. There is no place for the weak in this world, which means that only the strongest will be able to survive. Anastasia understood this better than anyone. She was not going to give up, even if she was surrounded from all sides. The war was not over yet, which meant there was no retreat. She would fight until her last breath, protecting those who needed her. She would not only protect her people, but she would do everything to survive herself, not for glory or power, but because too much depended on her. If she fell, her guild would collapse, and she could not allow that. Butler, Jack returned with a report, but he had no news. There was no information from the Empire, as if someone was carefully hiding everything that could shed light on the situation. This was alarming, but there was no choice but to continue the search. It would probably take more time to get the information we needed. It was obvious that someone was carefully covering their tracks. We would have to send our own people there, which meant training them and providing them with the necessary resources. Itan, having listened to the report, only nodded. He had expected such an answer, and therefore agreed, without further ado. But Jack did not stop there. He had another important question that was bothering him. The butler asked if the gentleman was really going to swear an oath to the temple. This decision seemed strange, because Can had never shown much respect for the church before, and now he was going to make a contract with it. Holy power cannot be mixed with the mind of the Itan family. The consequences could be unpredictable. It could hurt, make him vulnerable, or even weaken him. Was it worth it, especially for a stranger? But the Duke merely shrugged. He calmly stated that it made no difference to him. If it was necessary to achieve his goals, then he would do whatever it took, even if it involved risk. He also told me to tell him that the meeting at the temple would take place in a week. This meant that decisions had already been made, and he had no intention of backing down. Everything had to go according to plan, without unnecessary doubts and hesitations. Anastasia looked at the Duke carefully and asked if he had anything to tell her before meeting the priest. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were expectant. She wanted to hear something important. Can slowly turned to face her, and in that moment, her thoughts slipped away for a moment. She looked at him, and before her eyes flashed that strange dream that had been haunting her. Her mind was drawn back to those images. Just looking at him brought back memories of the dream, as if it wasn't just a dream, but something bigger, something that was meant to happen. She pushed the thoughts away sharply, not wanting to indulge in such fantasies. A naked male body was too bold, too unfamiliar. She had never seen anything like it and didn't know how to react. Khan noticed her strange expression and frowned. He didn't understand what she was thinking, but suddenly something flashed in her eyes that made him wonder what kind of ridiculous thoughts were swarming in her head. Anastasia suddenly snapped out of her thoughts and said with irritation that this was simply indecent. She had never spied on anyone and was not going to start now. But why was her heart beating so fast? The gentleman finally understood what was being discussed. He realized that this was not just a conversation, but a specific situation that needed to be analyzed and understood. He thought she was denying it all, as if she didn't understand the essence of the matter. But in fact, he was confident in his conclusions. The lady confirmed his words, adding that she had indeed never met him before, and therefore it was unfair to blame her for what he said. The gentleman smiled back. His smile was slightly mocking, but rather benevolent, because he understood why Anastasia so persistently denied everything. She tried again to explain that everything was not as he thought, but he noted that everyone is guaranteed the right to freedom and privacy in their personal lives. It was the first time he had encountered such an unusual and frank contract, and he did not hide his surprise. He wanted to say that this was exactly what was being discussed, but she, hearing his remarks, opened her mouth in surprise, not expecting such a turn of events. She didn't know what to answer because the terms of the contract were so vague that they could lead to misunderstandings, so she decided to be as clear as possible. She clarified that everyone has the right to a free personal life and privacy. Everything was said clearly without unnecessary words. To be honest, she didn't know much about personal relationships, and her memories of marriage weren't the best, but that didn't mean she hated men. If her views had been limited, the guild would not have reached the position it did. Her ability to make difficult decisions was essential to its success. Anastasia was well aware that there was no room for feelings in this contract. It was purely practical to avoid inconvenience for both parties. It was for this reason that she added this clause to the contract. And turning to the gentleman, she asked for forgiveness if this turned out to be too difficult for him. Mr. Can stated that he accepted her terms, and she asked doubtfully whether he wanted to change any points in the contract. For example, Khan suggested making the contract less obscene, but added that he had had enough of it. He was confident enough in his words that he had no plans to change the terms. He suddenly asked again if Anastasia trusted him right now. This question was unexpected and made her think a little, but she still answered him. The lady without hesitation answered that this was not so. Her words sounded direct, without unnecessary thought, and it was clear that she did not have such trust. This honest answer surprised him. He had not expected Anastasia to be so frank, and despite all his confidence, he felt a slight disappointment. She noted that in principle, his lordship had not signed the contract with full confidence either. This was obvious, and her words supported her position. Khan replied that this was not the case at all. He was simply curious and wanted to understand what was behind this decision, what made her so confident. The world was simple. Only the strongest survive. This thought flashed through his mind more than once as he observed the world around him, full of struggle and cruelty. Khan was always at the top. There was no room for weakness or compromise in his life. He was used to being a leader and never stooped below his level. This is what made his life boring and predictable. He didn't know what it meant to fight or push himself to the brink. Everything went according to a pre-written plan. But Anastasia was different. She seemed so fragile, as if she could break from one touch, but at the same time there was a special strength in her eyes. Khan couldn't understand where she got such a will to live. She added a little saltiness to his life that he was missing, and it made him think. He became curious about how far this could go. He was intrigued by her behavior and tried to understand what was really behind her determination. Anastasia thought that maybe it was a warning. She couldn't understand exactly what was happening, but she felt that everything was not as simple as it seemed. The gentleman said that it was time for them to go, but Anastasia wondered, was she doing the right thing? Should she continue on this path? In the end, he was the only option for her. Despite all the doubts, she knew that she had no other choice, and this was her decision. She had no intention of regretting. Even if her actions might be wrong, she would not look back because her choice was conscious. After several rituals, the man announced that the oath had been taken. This meant that everything was finished, and there was no turning back. Everything had changed. Duke of Itan was grateful for the help given to him. He knew that with this money, his business would improve, and he would be able to repay the debt. The Duke promised that all funds would be used for the needs of the temple, and his belief in the nobility of this act was firm. This was an important step for him. After these words, Anastasia decided it was time to move on. She knew they couldn't stay too long. There were important things to do ahead. But the Duke, without letting go of her hand, decided to stop her. He said that he had to congratulate her. After all, she had now become a part of his life. The Duke's woman. His words were serious, and he warned her that if she broke his promise, her heart would be broken. It was not just a threat, but a warning. Anastasia, without embarrassment, replied that the Duke had better take care of his health, so as not to find himself on the brink of death. She did not want to hear such words. Gray, who was standing nearby cautiously, suggested that since the lady had decided to stay in the Duke's house, perhaps they should think about moving the guild headquarters. However, Anastasia was categorical. She immediately replied that she did not agree to this. The guild must remain in the capital, since it had recently been founded in Tyrant. She added that the guild needed to monitor the activities of the Arga aristocracy. It was their direct responsibility, and Gray should obey her decision without unnecessary arguments. He had to understand that she had made a decision to stay here and be his lover. She didn't expect him to resist or try to change her. He asked her not to overload herself with tasks. He reminded her that if she felt tired, she could always delegate some of the work to him. When she tries to do everything herself, it hurts him to see how exhausted she is. He doesn't know how to help, but he still worries about her. Gradually, he began to feel like he played no role in her life. He didn't know what she needed, and he felt like he was becoming superfluous. She wanted to tell him about it, but decided to do it differently. She took his hand and confidently said that she needed him, despite everything. In her dreams, she had already seen the future, but it was foggy and disturbing. She felt that difficulties were waiting for her, although she did not want them. She turned to the edge, with despair in her voice. He had become her father's replacement, and she could no longer imagine her life without him. But he also has his own life, and his own affairs. She could not influence his choices, so she suggested that he return when he finished his business. Gray said he and Cass would go first. He was prepared for that, even though he knew it wouldn't be an easy ride, and it was just the beginning. The history of the Duke's women always ended badly, and Itan's mother was no exception. He did not want to repeat the fate of his predecessors. If he developed feelings stronger than just interest, he knew that she too could face a terrible future, just like everyone else. She should have understood that it was her choice, and should not regret the consequences if things did not go as she expected. After all, she herself approached him, she herself sought meetings, and now she was forced to bear the consequences of her decisions. The choice was always hers, and therefore the responsibility for everything that would happen also lay on her shoulders. She hoped that he would always be there supporting her, because she could not imagine her life without him, even in the most difficult moments. He said he needed some time to think. It was a big decision, and he needed to figure out what was going to happen next. She also guessed that he might have developed feelings for the Duke. She didn't know how to react to this, but she suspected that there was something. However, the guy was outraged by her assumption. He was sure that even despite the Duke's beauty, he was not interested in men. Suddenly, their path was interrupted. Anastasia could not understand why they stopped, and felt that something was wrong. She felt anxious. She looked out of the carriage to see what had happened. Her gaze immediately fell on the situation that had caused the delay. She thought that perhaps someone had simply gotten in their way, preventing them from continuing on their way. However, the situation seemed more tense. Anastasia screamed and asked Casa for help when she noticed the man swinging at their coachman. It was dangerous, and she couldn't stand aside. Casa quickly intervened to protect the coachman, and the man asked in surprise who this man was who dared to interfere with his actions. The man obviously didn't expect anyone to dare confront him. Apparently, he didn't know what to do with an equal. He was amazed. How could a knight threaten a defenseless child with a sword? To him, it seemed absurd, even boring. He assured that the coachman was not to blame, and having calmed the situation, said that he could continue on his way and return to his mistress. The man who was ready to attack began to get indignant, claiming that the guy simply approached the cart without permission and asked to move away. He continued to shout that the guy was rude to him, and even demanded that he move away from Count Brill himself, which only added fuel to the fire. The man couldn't understand how Casa dared to defend this guy, because for him it was an unacceptable act that had no justification. Casa asked again what the worldly bastard had said, clearly irritated by the behavior of a man he considered insignificant. The lady realized that the conversation would drag on for a long time, and sighing sadly, she prepared herself for the fact that they would have to spend quite a bit of time here. She offered everyone a little snack, trying to soften the situation, and began feeding the coachman so that he would not feel forgotten. As she watched this, she couldn't help but notice that Casa seemed to have no patience for people like this man. His disgust was obvious. Casa gave the man an angry look, hoping that he would think with his own brain and not make such mistakes in the future. He was surprised that with such skills, this man even dared to call himself a knight, and of course, he couldn't ignore it. The coachman, noticing what was happening, decided that this would drag on for ages. It seemed that Mr. Case was really very bored. The lady wondered whether she should intervene and stop him, or let Casa continue and scold this presumptuous knight. The coachman, nevertheless, reminded them that they were late for the Duke, and he did not want Madame Anastasia to be reprimanded for being late. Anastasia, smiling, asked Kasia to stop this, knowing that their time was limited, and they needed to be more restrained. Casa smiled back and said innocently that he hadn't even started yet, and a look of mischief could be seen on his face. Anastasia, realizing that he had gotten too carried away, told him that he should stop as the situation could get out of control. Apparently, the carriage was being repaired, and Anastasia remembered that she knew some people from her guild who could help them. She suggested contacting these friends because they wouldn't charge money for the repairs, and it would be much more convenient for them. When she remembered the name of Count Brill, she thought because this family was expelled from the capital and sent north, deprived of their former position. Her thoughts about the Count were full of doubts because despite the fact that they had lost a lot, they still retained their pride and nobility. The man said that the Count told him that he would not investigate the incident. He promised not to interfere in what was happening, but he could not ignore the situation. The man admitted that he can't just ignore people's bad manners, especially when it puts safety at risk. He offered his own solution. He suggested that they agree on one solution that might satisfy everyone, suggesting, as a possible solution, the common use of the wheel from their cart. Anastasia, not understanding the essence of the proposal, only smiled quietly. She did not see the meaning in his words and remained calm, not showing any emotions. She noted that the wheel they were about to fix didn't look broken anyway, even though the man insisted it needed attention. But her words fell on deaf ears. The man took her refusal as a negative answer, but still asked again whether she would continue to discuss this proposal. He was waiting for her final decision. Anastasia did not argue and replied that they would simply break the wheel if it got in the way. The solution was simple and quick, without unnecessary talk. She added that there was no need to worry, as her team was very experienced, and they would handle the task without any problems. Experience and confidence were her keys to success. She assured the man that no one in the carriage would be harmed. Even if the wheel did require intervention, everything would be done carefully and safely. Anastasia turned to Kasia to get started without wasting time. She remained focused on solving the problem, even if it caused dissatisfaction among others. The man slowed down, trying to figure out what exactly was going on. Kasia quietly noted that if he hit the wheel again, it might crack or break, making the situation worse. Anastasia insisted that Kasia continue ignoring the misgivings. At this moment, the Count came out of the carriage, accompanied by loud cries, attracting the attention of those around him. Anastasia, seeing the Count, felt relieved, thinking that now everything would be decided. She believed that his daughter was next to him, and this was an important point. Anastasia's gaze fell on the girl's outfit, and she immediately realized that this meeting was not accidental. They were going to meet Duke Itan, and this was an important event. Anastasia greeted the Count and his daughter, introducing herself as a representative of Duke Itan's family. This was the moment when everything could change, and she was ready to act. The Count was outraged that someone was throwing a hammer at a carriage with people inside. Anastasia just smiled quietly in response, not caring about his outrage. She explained that she was trying to act quickly because they had asked for the wheel back. A quick solution was important to avoid further delays and problems. They hadn't expected her to show up, and Anastasia quickly apologized. She was rushing to meet the Duke and added that they could get there even without one wheel. The Duke asked her for what purpose she was going to him. The lady answered with a smile, hiding all her thoughts and fears. Anastasia explained that she had been invited and noted that this was precisely the reason they were also going to the Duke. It was simple. Count Brill's daughter was stunned. She couldn't believe that this girl had received an invitation from the Duke himself. It seemed incredible. Isabella remembered that the Duke also had dark hair. Perhaps she was related to him. Doubts did not leave her. Anastasia looked like a simple village girl, as if she was from the family of some baron. This did not inspire confidence, but Isabella still felt anxious because of her intuition. And at some point, Anastasia, apparently noticing her tension, asked again where they were heading. The man replied that their path lay to the Duchy of Itan, which seemed quite logical. Anastasia noticed that their route coincided and suggested that they move into their carriage. It was convenient and reasonable. Then the wheels wouldn't have to be divided. But the man didn't seem ready to accept such help, saying it was too much. In response, Isabella, holding back her gratitude, said that it was too generous of her, they could not refuse. She thanked Anastasia for her help, to which the lady replied with a smile that if this could be considered help, she would be glad. Anastasia von Isaac. It was a name Isabella had never heard of among the high-profile aristocracy. There was something mysterious about it. Anastasia received an unexpected invitation from the Duke himself, which was a big surprise for her since it was rare for anyone to attract his attention. Kesa couldn't help but ask why the lady had decided to contact the Duke, and it seemed let them down in this matter. He was looking for an explanation for her actions. She told him that all this was necessary to fulfill the terms of the contract she had signed. The answer was cryptic, but sounded convincing. Isabella did not stand aside and asked what kind of relationship Anastasia had with this man. She could not help but ask this question. And although their relationship was obviously not a work one, Isabella still could not understand how to perceive their relationship, not as a subordinate and an employer, but as something else. Anastasia smiled and explained that Casa was her loyal friend and companion. This answer immediately dotted all the I's and crossed the T's, and Isabella understood her. She noticed that recently, older women often like younger men, but admitted that this was the first time she had seen such a couple with her own eyes. Casa was a little irritated to hear these words. He couldn't help but remark that she was too talkative, and perhaps she should just shut up and get into the carriage. The Count could not help but notice that Casa, being a subordinate of Madame Anastasia, behaved too familiarly with her, which in his opinion was not entirely appropriate. Anastasia, feeling the tension, apologized to the Count, explaining that she couldn't do anything about it. It was just the way their relationship had developed. The Count was astonished to hear that this young man was a top-class mercenary. It was more than he could have imagined. There were only 3 such mercenaries in the world, and they were extremely difficult to hire, even if you offered fabulous money. This only increased interest. The Count looked at Kasu carefully and noticed that he had scarlet eyes and hair, which immediately caught his attention. This was extremely unusual. He began to suspect that this was the scarlet fox that had been rumored. This discovery really surprised him. The Count explained that he had not introduced himself properly, so they had not recognized him at first. It was awkward, but he hoped that they would forgive him for this misunderstanding. The Count asked Casa to forgive their knight just this once, explaining that it was an accidental conflict. He did not want it to overshadow their relationship. Anastasia, without wasting any time, turned to Isabella and gently said that it was time for them to go. After all, the Duke, as she knew, had been waiting for them for a long time. They had to be on time. Isabella was outraged. This impudent girl was talking to her like that. She would have gladly answered her, but she was not in the mood now because of the ball. At that moment, Grey, Anastasia's servant, came up and announced that they had arrived at the place. Everything was ready, and their meeting with the Duke was not long in coming. Isabella, assessing the Duke's mansion, quietly remarked that for a man living on the border, it was quite a nice house. It was impressive and beautiful. The Count, trying to figure out where the Duke himself was, continued to look around. And at that moment their gaze fell on a very tall man. When Isabella saw this man, she was shocked. She could not believe that Duke Itan himself was standing in front of her. It was impossible. The rumors about the Duke were indeed true. The title, the money, the power, even his face. All of this personified greatness. He turned out to be much more impressive than she thought. Isabella confidently decided that this Duke would be hers. She had no doubts about her charm, and now she had to do everything to conquer him. Approaching the Duke, Isabella introduced herself and greeted him with a smile, confident that he would notice her. Her manner was refined and confident. However, the Duke, not paying any attention to her, passed by immediately, expressing joy that Anastasia had finally arrived. He was glad to see her. Anastasia, calmly and confidently, replied that she could not ignore his invitation. She always values relationships that can be useful for both. Isabella was shocked to see the Duke simply ignoring her. Her surprise increased when she realized that Anastasia had no rights to him. Isabella stood there in amazement, not believing her eyes. Not only was this woman touching her Duke so unceremoniously, but she was not hiding it at all. Anastasia couldn't understand what kind of relationship she had with the Duke. He asked her again what she was doing, because at this rate, Brill's daughter might start to get suspicious. Anastasia decided that now was the best time to use the situation to her advantage. This was the moment to act decisively. She asked the Duke to play along with her in this situation. He understood her intentions perfectly, and as if in response, kissed her, realizing that this was part of their plan. Casa was also a little surprised by what was happening, but his reaction was not as pronounced. The Count and Isabella, however, were completely horrified by what they saw. Can told Anastasia that he had done everything as she had asked, but it all seemed a little unnatural and even strange to everyone around him. However, Anastasia noticed that he didn't really need to do what he did. He was lifting her up in his arms, and she thought that it was time for them to enter the room. The Duke suddenly shouted that all this was not at all what he expected. He could not understand what it all meant and what exactly was happening at the moment. When his guests arrived, he was so busy that he didn't even bother to greet them properly. His behavior seemed completely inappropriate for such an event. The butlers were at a loss and could not understand why the Duke should receive guests in such a manner. They had expected a completely different approach. Anastasia told her father that she had had enough and it was time to leave. She was determined and was not going to continue this strange scene. But the Count did not agree with her decision and immediately asked the butler who this woman was. He could not understand who could be the one who had attracted the Duke's attention. Jack replied that this woman was the Duke's lover. The Count was shocked, not believing his ears. He had never met a woman with such hair color, and the situation itself was strange. He tried to convince them that such a relationship was impossible, but Jack the butler said that in the Duke's family, only one heir was born from generation to generation. So Jack wished them luck, and the Count was simply shocked. He could not believe that everything was happening this way. Isabella, holding the Count's hand, explained that this was the Duke's territory, and they must respect his rights of ownership. She then added that today's incident will remain in their memory forever, and they will never forget what happened. Casa looked at them with a smile, realizing that his mistress Anastasia was perfectly aware of the whole situation and its consequences. Once inside, Anastasia turned to the Duke and said that he could now let her go since their conversation had come to an end. Her confusion was obvious. She did not understand why he had remained silent all this time and did not interfere in what was happening. Although she signed the contract, she felt ashamed of her behavior, which did not meet her expectations. The relationship between them is essentially taboo. The gentleman asked if she was going to hide behind the terms of the contract. Then he asked if she had achieved her goal. Anastasia did not quite understand what he was talking about and felt embarrassed. The Duke noted that the video of her son and the intruders might have suggested that something was wrong, and he thought they had angered her. Anastasia realized that she had been exposed, and she realized this the moment the Duke spoke. So he said she could continue to act the way she saw fit if it would help her achieve what she wanted. All this happened because the Duke really believed that this situation was not so bad and was ready to put up with it. Anastasia looked at the Duke and with a slight smile asked if he meant to say that he sometimes agreed to play along with her if the situation required it. She had not expected such an outcome, but still decided to clarify his position. Can Itan calmly confirmed her assumption, making it clear that he really didn't mind. However, if she was going to play this game, she would need to be much more confident in her actions. He watched her reaction carefully and noticed that the lady was not without courage. However, Anastasia did not immediately understand why he suddenly decided to make such a remark. Then the Duke explained his idea. If she wanted to practice to make their union more convincing, he was willing to play along. There was no hint of mockery in his voice only cold determination. He spoke so confidently that Anastasia was momentarily speechless. Her eyes widened in surprise. Was he really ready to go so far for this performance? The Duke noticed her confusion and explained that, in his opinion, the main problem was the speed of her reaction. It was because of this that their couple could look unnatural. However, Anastasia shook her head and said that this was not the case at all. She suggested another way to solve the problem: to hold a ball for the Toho nobility, to dot all the I's and cross all the T's. The Duke frowned slightly, not immediately understanding what she was getting at. Then Anastasia cited Count Brill as an example, who, despite the lack of an invitation, held himself extremely confidently. Not only had the Count shown up unannounced, but he had acted as if he had every right to do so. This could only mean one thing: he didn't have much respect for the Duke. The Count's behavior only proved that he did not take Can Itan seriously. It was obvious that he considered himself equal, and perhaps even superior to the new Duke. If a newly elevated Duke fails to prove himself in high society, his influence will eventually begin to wane, and his position will weaken. Eventually, the Toho nobles might simply forget about his existence, meaning that everyone would have the opportunity to advance their own interests at his expense. Some, like Count Brill, will try to arrange advantageous marriages by marrying their daughters to him, hoping to strengthen their family's position. And others will even begin to look at his lands, believing that the young Duke will not be able to maintain control over the north. If he organizes a lavish banquet and introduces Anastasia as his beloved, then he can once and for all set priorities and make the Toho nobility respect the Duke. After this meeting, Anastasia was sure that Isabella, the daughter of Count Brill, would not give up so easily. She was clearly not one to give in without a fight, especially when it came to her ambitions. Duke Can Itan thought about it and wondered why Anastasia had suddenly come to such a conclusion. He saw no reason why the Count's daughter would persist. Anastasia realized with surprise that the Duke really didn't understand this. It seemed obvious to her that Isabella wouldn't stop at the first failure, but for him it was news. Without going into details, the Duke simply asked her to simply organize a banquet to her taste. He clearly did not intend to waste time on such questions and gave her complete freedom. She was surprised by his reaction. However, without explaining himself, he simply said calmly that she could go as if everything had been decided and no further discussion was required. His indifference upset her. He didn't even listen to what she was saying, and that was unpleasant. He didn't seem to care about her opinion at all, and that made her think. But when she was already leaving, he suddenly turned to her. His voice was calm but firm. If she wanted to accept something, she did not need to ask his permission. These words surprised her. It turned out that he trusted her more than she thought. Although they barely knew each other, he allowed her to act independently. And yet, she found it hard to believe that such trust had already been established between them. They hadn't even really talked, let alone gotten to know each other. So doubts did not leave her. Could she trust him as much as he seemed to trust her? Or was it just a formality that concealed something else? While Anastasia was thinking about this, Jack's butler could discuss with her all the issues concerning the upcoming banquet. He was the one who knew how to best organize everything according to etiquette. However, Anastasia stood her ground. The Duke needed to appear before the nobles in person. She believed that this was an important step and was not going to back down. Jack looked at the Duke and said that it was time to meet them. There was no point in delaying the moment any longer, even if the previous Duke preferred to stay away and not interfere in the affairs of the nobles. The decisions that the nobles made were far from straightforward. However, the banquet provided an excellent opportunity to make a statement, show their intentions, and demonstrate their strength to others. Anastasia told Can Itan almost the same thing. She is not only smart, but also able to see the situation deeper than it seems at first glance. However, the butler still hoped that the master would not trust her too much. The Duke simply replied calmly that he thought she deserved it. If you were going to thank someone for their courage, why not do it with dignity? Even flowers as a token of appreciation would be quite appropriate. The butler was shocked. From the very beginning, the gentleman acted as if he trusted this woman with complete confidence, and this greatly surprised him. That is why he made a contract in the temple. However, the Duke himself admitted that he did not even intend to do this at first. Everything happened unexpectedly. But here's the strange thing. Suddenly, he became interested in how it would all end. The butler wondered, what if in the end, she simply won't help them? This option is quite possible. However, the Duke simply said calmly that so be it. After all, her will to live was incredibly strong, and this could not be ignored. That's why he was sure that she wouldn't betray him. And if suddenly something didn't work out, there would be nothing terrible about that either. The Lord was tired of all this. He was the strongest man in the world, a master of the sword, and everyone around him was afraid of just one name, Duke of Itan. Men in power often fear not enemies or intrigue, but themselves. Those who are bound to the ducal family by love are doomed. A curse awaits them. The woman, shaking with fear, screamed at him not to come closer. A knife gleamed in her hands. Her eyes darted around, looking for an exit, but the room was closed. Her voice broke as she screamed out words of despair. If he really loved her, he had to stop, not do this. Otherwise, it would all be in vain. He didn't believe her words. Asked again if she understood what she was saying. Even if he let her go, she would stay with him, even after death. He grabbed her arms, shaking them, breaking into a scream. Her delirious words made no sense. This was madness, and she had simply lost her mind, gone crazy. A small boy watched the scene unfolding in the room. He stood silently in the shadows, clenching his fists, unable to intervene. The man screamed that her family was too pure to understand. She gave him her heart, but rejected his love, as if he was unworthy. He didn't understand why she didn't accept his feelings. The girl rejected him, calling him a monster. For her, he was a monster, not a human. A monster trying to be like people. His love is a lie. He is incapable of real feelings. She called herself a saint, and him an empty shell. His mother hated the ducal family, as did Can. She suffered, died in agony. This memory was etched in his mind forever. The father was so obsessed with his mother that he could not bear to lose her, and followed her. Without her, life lost its meaning for him. The boy who watched this concluded that love is something terrible. This feeling destroys, leaving only pain and suffering. Grandfather told him to remember this lesson. Never forget what path awaits him and his descendants. The fate is already predetermined. There is no escape from it. The darkness surrounds their family, and no one will be able to get rid of it, neither he nor his children. If Anastasia helps, the consequences will not only affect her, he himself will be in danger. It is inevitable. The gentleman made another remark. Hyde had already returned. This news alarmed everyone nearby. The butler froze in shock. And in the meantime, Hyde had already made his way inside. He was fast and was now standing at the window behind him. The Duke asked, with a squint, if there was any progress. The guy, smiling confidently, answered that, of course there was. The butler, puzzled, asked why the door was needed at all. But the guy changed the subject. Anastasia has a true name. Her real name was Elvira de Arodel. The word struck like thunder, turning everything that was known about her upside down. Once upon a time, she wore a crown and ruled the great empire of Arga, decided destinies, and made important decisions. Now the past remains only in memories, and she herself was forced to hide. The Arga Empire has fallen, its glory gone, and with it all who once served the throne. If this woman is indeed the one, then this is not just a runaway, but a legendary dark-haired witch. The butler asked again in a reserved tone, wanting to make sure the information was correct. If it was true, then they were looking at not just an intrigue, but a real political threat. Hyde replied, with a grin, that this information had been hard to come by. He could not reveal the source, but he was sure of its veracity, because too many things matched up. The butler frowned and cautiously noted that this woman could be a spy. Her appearance next to the Duke could not be considered accidental, especially considering her past. But the Duke simply brushed off these suspicions, considering them nonsense. For him, it looked like more speculation, not worth his attention. Hyde nodded reservedly, noting that he himself did not believe in such guesses. However, his tone betrayed doubt, because he knew how dangerous such coincidences could be. The butler irritably told him to shut up and not interfere with the conversation. Now was not the time for useless arguments, especially when it came to the Duke's safety. The Duke, unlike them, was lost in his thoughts. If this woman really was Anastasia, the former Empress, then her appearance could cause a storm. The Empire would not ignore it. The enemies will only need a pretext to take advantage of the situation. Under the pretext of diplomacy, they will be able to impose their conditions, take control of everything, and weaken his position. Now everything became crystal clear, but despite this, the situation began to seem more and more interesting to him. The more difficult the game, the more interesting it is to play. The Duke thought it would be useful to observe the capital's nobility, to better understand their intrigues. His butler expressed concern, noting that if this woman were left unattended, the consequences could be unpredictable and even dangerous. Hyde watched his master closely and noted with a slight grin that he was indeed smart. There was a confidence in his gaze, as if he had already thought out the next step and knew how everything should develop further. After a short pause, the Duke turned to Hyde, intending to speak. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that bespoke a man accustomed to command and making decisions without hesitation. Jack repeated with restraint that the Duke had addressed Hyde specifically, but when everyone turned in his direction, Hyde was no longer there. The disappearance was so lightning fast that it seemed almost unreal. The butler flushed with irritation, and without holding back, shouted, demanding that Hyde stop leaving the room through the window. Apparently, this strange and unacceptable for the palace walls way of moving had become a habit for him. Jack sighed heavily, desperately, trying to figure out how many more times he would have to repeat the same request. It seemed that Hyde simply ignored his comments, continuing to do his own thing. The Duke merely chuckled and told the butler to drop the subject. There was someone who needed to be caught, and that was far more important than complaining about Hyde and his unorthodox methods of movement. However, before doing this, the Duke decided to allow himself a little rest. Jack, with a slight bow, wished him a pleasant rest, trying to hide his irritation at what was happening. The Duke sighed wearily and muttered that he was tired of learning something. The butler, slightly surprised by this confession, turned his gaze to the book that stood alone on the table in front of his master. When he saw the title, he was momentarily speechless. It was a relationship guide for inexperienced men, and Jack wasn't sure how to react to it. It was too unexpected for the Duke to read. At this point, Anastasia turned to Hyde, her voice serious. She made it clear that they had something important to discuss, and her gaze showed a determination that brooked no argument. The guy felt deeply disappointed. He had just finished a long day of work and did not expect to be met with such questions. After that, they sat down at the table. The gentleman studying her asked what exactly she wanted to discuss with him, as if it was important. Anastasia wasted no time, and looking at him, said that she knew his name. She was confident in her information and was not afraid to say so. She approached him directly because she had the impression that he had all the answers, but what exactly she was interested in, she had not yet revealed. At that moment, the boy got scared. His face turned pale. He quickly started making excuses, assuring her that he wouldn't say anything, even if he was tortured. He was very scared, and Anastasia noticed it. She was surprised by how vulnerable this man was, although he looked confident. She calmly explained that she didn't want to scare him. All she wanted was to mend fences with Jack. She knew her guild was under threat. There were more and more displeased looks around her, and her main fear was not what would happen to her, but that she would let the Duke down. When the guy realized what she really wanted to talk about, he relaxed. He thanked her for the coffee, thinking that it could be a pleasant moment. He said that the butler was a man of character, and the lady was surprised why he thought so. because you can always find an approach to anyone." The gentleman thanked her for the tea and added that it was time to go. He had no intention of staying, despite the conversation not yet finished. The lady turned to him, noticing that he seemed to be planning to leave work early. Her words were soft, but full of hints. Hyde replied that she had no right to dispose of his time. He himself decided when and how much to work. It was his personal business. The lady smiled and curiously reminded him that the Duke had said she could do whatever she wanted. This offended him a little, and he did not answer. She added that Hyde had probably been yearning for a vacation for a long time, to some warm place where he could relax and forget about his worries. He came closer and asked with interest what exactly she wanted to know. His voice became a little quieter, as if she had touched on an important topic. The lady answered with restraint that, in fact, everything was simple. She was not looking for complicated answers. She just needed to understand him a little. Hyde looked at her doubtfully, arguing that there was nothing simple in the world. Everything was always more complicated than it seemed at first glance, especially in relationships. She agreed with him with a slight smile, noting that every person has their own weaknesses, and she would like to know what he really likes. The boy thought about what was bothering him. He knew he had something important to share, and he decided to say that it was both his weakness and his favorite hobby. It was something amazing, and the lady really wanted to know what it was. He added carefully that if she did hear his answer, he hoped that she would really send him on a long-awaited vacation. This decision was extremely important to him. The lady confidently replied that of course she always kept her promises. This was her firm position, and she was not going to back down from her words. This was a matter of principle for her. Anastasia, thinking, realized that the guy might be paying for his actions. If his actions do not live up to expectations, then perhaps it will not be easy for her to fulfill her promise. She insistently asked him to quickly tell her what his sweetness is. Hyde, a little embarrassed, pointed out that it had to do with his status as a duke, but Anastasia disagreed, saying that there could be no such explanation. He finally admitted that his true desire was to go on vacation. The lady was a little angry, realizing that the men in this house were behaving strangely. She was irritated that she could not establish normal communication with them. All this brought her considerable inconvenience. In the evening, Anastasia approached Kasia with a question about what the guy had just said. She wanted to understand on what basis he had made such statements and how this was connected with her promises. Kasia, slightly puzzled, replied that he had heard about it from the maids. However, he could not be completely sure of the veracity of this information, and therefore did not draw any final conclusions. Just behind this door is the Duke's bedroom, and in this room lives his beloved, who has been here many times and is accustomed to this place. Apparently, she is already considered the mistress here. Perhaps it is time for serious steps, and they should think about getting officially married. The lady sternly told Kasia that he really had a big mouth and pressed his lips together, making it clear that some things should not be discussed out loud. She added that there were certain things employers were not supposed to say, and he needed to understand that Kasia was silent, trying to process what she meant. The lady turned to him and said that since he was here, he should take care to block the door separating her space from the Duke. Kasia asked, in surprise, if she really wanted to put up a cabinet to create a barrier between herself and the swordmaster. He wasn't quite sure why that was necessary. The girl replied that for her it would at least mean personal boundaries, and asked him to hurry with this so that she could feel more confident within her walls. The guy agreed to help and told her to step aside a little. With a light movement, he dragged the cabinet over without much effort. The lady also asked for a toolbox to be brought to her. She was serious, and it was clear that she intended to do everything properly. Kasia, a little irritated, couldn't understand why she was doing this, but she calmly explained that she needed to fix the cabinet in its new position so that it wouldn't move. The Duke was sure it was pointless, and the lady could not understand why this particular room was so important to him. He had explained it several times, but she did not get the point. Anastasia could not understand why the Duke was so attached to this place. She saw no sense in his insistence and could not understand what motivated him to desire it. They always tried to maintain the appearance of a couple, but Anastasia found it difficult to hide her doubts. She was worried that the Duke was paying too much attention to her. She hoped that her efforts would not lead to trouble. Anastasia did not want to become overly sensitive because it could jeopardize their relationship. That's why she decided to hammer nails first, to distract herself from thinking about what was happening. This decision was caused by her desire to somehow control the situation. At that moment, she heard the Duke's voice, confidently declaring that he would pull out the nails, even if she were hammering them in. It was a strange but confident promise. The Duke explained that all her efforts would be in vain. He wanted her to realize that it was completely useless and that no amount of her efforts would change the situation. Anastasia explained that her actions were aimed at her own peace of mind. That is why her smile was nervous, and she hid her inner feelings. He thought that she was afraid that she would not be able to withstand the tension, and at some point would break down and attack him. This explanation confused him, but he could not say anything definite. Anastasia felt a little confused and surprised. She couldn't understand why he said it that way. She thought he was just talking to himself. Mr. Can noticed that last time she literally showered him with compliments, but now she seemed to block his path like a wall, creating distance between them. He didn't know what to expect from her because her behavior was always unexpected for him. At some point, he thought that he was just bothering her, creating unnecessary problems. Anastasia, feeling his gaze, explained that she simply felt uncomfortable. It had nothing to do with him, but rather with how she felt. He asked her with interest why she felt so uncomfortable, to which she explained that he was giving her the same powers as he had given himself, and this put her in an awkward position. Thoughts were running through her head that in a house where debts already exceeded reasonable limits, she would not want to deal with this even alone, especially with a man nearby. Duke of Itan took the situation too seriously, giving her not only authority but also responsibility, which she felt put too much emphasis on her actions. He agreed with her observation, but added that it shouldn't worry her since she has the right to decide what to do in the current situation, without relying on someone else's opinion. He noticed that since she wasn't ignoring the situation and was still trying to work with him, it meant that she truly cared about his well-being, which clearly didn't go unnoticed. He sincerely said that it was a good job and that he enjoyed taking care of her, expressing support and confidence that he would help her with any task that came up. Can suggested that Anastasia continue to work just as hard and not worry, assuring her that she could count on his full support in any endeavor. Anastasia, a little confused, did not immediately understand what he was talking about. She could not understand exactly what he meant and what he was actually offering her. The thought flashed through her mind that perhaps he was going to seduce her, believing that if he was handsome and charming, he could allow himself any behavior, even such a daring one. Anastasia blushed with embarrassment when she realized where his conversation could lead. She did not expect such frankness. Meanwhile, Casa arrived with important news. In the evening, Casa sat in a tree, thinking. He thought about what had happened during the day and tried to understand what was really going on in the relationship between Anastasia and Cain. Casa always thought that the Duke was genuinely interested in Anastasia. He watched them interact, and his doubts gradually disappeared. He believed that her feelings were beginning to change too. Duke of Itan was becoming more and more enchanted by Anastasia. He noticed how she paid attention to his words. Although she had not yet confessed her feelings, it was difficult to hide. Anastasia, however, did not dare to confess her feelings. She kept her emotions to herself, perhaps out of fear or doubt, but inside she felt a growing attraction. Women who married men from the ducal family often faced difficulties. No noble titles could save them from pressure, intrigue, and the harsh realities of life. Casa was becoming increasingly worried about Anastasia. He was beginning to doubt whether she should take the risk of entering into this relationship. He wasn't sure that everything would be as she imagined. Suddenly, Casa noticed something strange. Jumping down from the tree, he felt the need to warn someone that now was not the time for reflection. The mood was tense, and things were getting dangerous. He suggested hurrying up and finishing everything as quickly as possible. Time was of the essence, and he knew he had to act before the situation got out of hand. He was prepared for any eventuality. Casa asked, displeased what was going on with the one who was making him wait. His anxiety was growing, and his patience was running out. He knew he had to be prepared for any answer. He added that the person who had violated his patience probably did not understand the consequences. Casa was direct, and his threat was not an empty word. He was ready to act decisively. And then, to his surprise, a guy rolled out of the bushes. Casa raised his eyebrows, slightly surprised but not confused. He was ready to figure out what was happening now. The boy admitted it was him, and it was obvious he was uncomfortable. His confusion and fear were obvious. Casa appreciated his condition, but he needed more information. Casa got to know him and said that if he hadn't been around for a little while, all that would have been left of the guy would have been his horns and legs. He joked, calling him a mouse tail, and smiled. The boy, apparently a little taken aback, replied that he would be more careful next time. He realized that the gentleman was to some extent dependent on him. The boy confirmed his words and handed over the bottle, adding that their guild could repay for the help. This was their offer to Casa. Casa was a little surprised. He began to examine the bottle carefully, trying to understand what was special about it and why this offer was made to him. The boy quickly said that he was leaving and urged Kasia to make a decision quickly. Time was running out, and there was no time to waste. Casa, without rushing to make a choice, nevertheless asked if he was really so scary that this guy would be so persistent. This worried him. The boy, noticing that someone might hear, warned Casa to speak more quietly since the Duke was nearby. This was an important remark. Casa wasn't particularly impressed. He continued to say confidently that nothing would change. The guy, meanwhile, claimed that a real monster lived here. Casa was surprised to hear the boy speak about the Duke. It was not what he expected to hear, and there was a note of displeasure in his voice. The boy, feeling the tension, jumped up sharply and whispered a warning to him to speak more quietly. Wherever the Duke was, his eyes and ears were always there. Casa took the boy off himself, setting him aside. He already knew what he needed to tell him and was ready to receive from him all the information that was in his heart. The guy was nervous and frankly said that he couldn't do it because if he told everything, the monster would probably kill him for it. Fear was visible in his eyes. Casa, without losing his composure, calmly replied that if he did not tell him everything, then he himself would deal with him and force him to reveal all the secrets. The boy, realizing the threat, began to tell that the Duke was mentally unstable and prone to paranoia. Casa had known this for a long time, and he was not interested in hearing a repetition. The boy decided that the most important news for him was precisely its disclosure, but Casa just shrugged. He already knew about it and decided that the boy should leave. He decided to take a walk to calm down a bit and clear his thoughts. At such moments, walks always helped him to collect himself. Suddenly, he felt the presence of a man and immediately turned to see who it was. He found out that the Duke himself was nearby. The Duke had a strange aura about him that made him a little wary. The Duke, noticing him, turned to the boy, commenting on the night views. Casa was a little embarrassed, not knowing what to answer. He said that in principle, yes, it really is a nice view for a night walk. Casa couldn't help but notice that the Duke had also decided to go out to get some fresh air. It was a rather strange, but no less interesting moment. The Duke said nothing in response. He simply looked at the boy, silently, leaving behind a kind of tense silence that did not leave his face. Casa couldn't figure out what exactly was emitting such an aura from the Duke, and felt that his presence was a little disconcerting. He decided to leave. Turning around, he headed towards the exit and moved a little to the side. Approaching the wall, he leaned against it, trying to relax a little after the strange meeting. He exhaled heavily, feeling his breath struggle in his chest. The Duke's proximity made him not only anxious, but also slightly panicked. It was hard to understand why it was so hard to breathe next to him. And so the swordmaster, who seemed to always be one step ahead, found himself powerless against what was happening. Anastasia, as always, did not lose her grip. Her lips uttered words that surprised everyone. When the Duke was around, Anastasia felt protected. Everything seemed fine, and that was right, because safety came first, and there was someone nearby who could guarantee it. The Duke really cared about her, and she felt it. Sometimes it was hard to understand his feelings, but one way or another, his care showed itself, and Anastasia understood that she really liked something about him. That night, when Anastasia fell asleep, her face was slightly tense, as if something was bothering her. It was that strange dream that she couldn't forget no matter how hard she tried. She hoped that at least today she would have a peaceful sleep. But unfortunately, reality always turned out to be different. Instead, she found herself in the very center of disturbing images and restless thoughts. Anastasia couldn't understand where she was. There were people standing around her, and in front of her was a huge hall, like a banquet hall. Everything seemed unreal, like in some strange dark dream. And then, among the strange sounds, she heard echoes of something wrong. The noise grew louder, and she felt anxiety growing. Something was wrong, and she couldn't figure out what it was. It was too strange to be true. Anastasia didn't want to believe what was happening. Everything around her was hostile and alien, and she tried to find an explanation for this nightmare. Her mind could not accept the idea that this was a prophecy about the Duke's future. She could not believe that such a nightmare could come true, that these shadows could become reality. In this future, she felt the Duke had done something terrible. He was capable of murder, and this thought made Anastasia furious. Why did she have to see such horrific images? Anastasia couldn't understand how anyone could kill the swordmaster. It seemed absurd. The swordmaster was always ready. He was merciless and invincible, and the thought of his fall was terrible. Anastasia firmly believed that dreams never lie. This conviction was so strong that she did not doubt their predictive power. She could not understand who among those around her was capable of such a crazy gait, which led to such strange consequences. She had put a lot of effort, emotional energy, and time into the relationship, so when something unexpected happened, she felt disappointed. At that moment, Jack the Duke's butler entered the room, and noticing her uneasiness, answered her question by proposing a plan for the upcoming banquet. Anastasia thanked him for his work, adding that things were moving along quite quickly, and overall she was pleased with how things were developing. She was surprised at how quickly he was able to put together a guest list. He seemed reluctant to help her from the start. The butler listened to her comments in silence, promising to take everything she said into account. He explained that the Duke never held banquets. That was the whole reason. Now, thanks to this conversation, she understood why Jack looked so nervous and agitated. A butler's ball is not just an ordinary event. It is a chance to show off his best qualities, to show what he is capable of, and what he is as a servant. It is also an opportunity to highlight the status of his master, and in this case, it was his daughter. Organizing the perfect banquet for a butler is not just a dream. It is a task that requires skill and attention to every, even the most insignificant element. For the lady organizing such an event, it was a chance to find the right leverage on her servant. Anastasia turned to Jack, assuring him that this banquet would be of great importance to everyone. It was important not only in terms of social status, but also for the reputation of the Duke himself. She emphasized that this banquet was the debut of the new Duke Itan, and all the nobles of Tojo would be watching him closely. They would rate his behavior and manner of doing business on a scale of 1 to 10. At this moment, the Duke's fate was being decided. Either he would be accepted and bowed to, or they would try to absorb him and use him for their own interests. Everything depended on how he conducted this meeting. Anastasia also noted that this first banquet was a great opportunity to meet all the important representatives of Toho. She wanted to observe how they reacted to his presence and behavior. It was important that none of the Toho nobles dared to stand in the Duke's way. Anastasia knew that the success of the event could play a key role in establishing his position in noble society. The lady thought that this was a great opportunity for Jack. He could show everyone his skills, his abilities as a butler, and make his master look the most worthy in the eyes of everyone. Anastasia said that Jack could demonstrate his skills and organizational abilities. This was the moment when he could glorify himself and demonstrate that he was worthy of his high position. Jack felt a little embarrassed by this admission. He always knew that he was capable of doing his job at a high level, but still, this situation made him feel a little awkward. You need to plan everything carefully, taking into account the budget, but don't worry about money. It won't be a problem. Everything should be taken into account. The lady reminded that one should not forget about her guild, as it can help in the organization, ensuring everything is at the highest level. The Chaos Guild always makes dreams come true, and relying on it, you can arrange a real celebration. The possibilities of this organization are limitless. Jack felt annoyed. The witch was directly using his wishes and money for her own purposes. This made him a little angry, and he was not sure of her intentions. However, for some reason this event will be significant for him. There will finally be something important and unusual in his life, although he still doubted it. Despite the fact that she had done him a favor, Jack could not believe in her sincerity and continued to be wary, not believing in her good intentions. But for the Duke's sake, he was still willing to take steps forward. Casa noticed that Jack had become more agitated, and this interested him. Casa approached the lady and asked what she was talking about with the butler. He noticed that he was reacting to something wrong. The lady replied that nothing special had happened, but Jack, in her opinion, was in a good mood, which surprised her. The lady added that she simply gave him what he had long dreamed of, and this was the reason for the butler's mood. Anastasia planned to give Kaja a separate room. She hoped that he would have already gone to the Duke's guard to settle everything. Casa replied that he had gone to the guards, but had found no one. The lady was surprised and outraged by his words. She did not like what had happened. She couldn't understand who was protecting him now. And then Casa said that he was capable of taking care of himself if something happened. The lady urgently demanded a meeting with the Duke, believing that their tea party should end. Everything was becoming too serious for simple relaxation. Casa wished her a good journey, but before she left, she asked him to follow her. He had forgotten what rights he had to be there. The boy said he didn't see why he should go if she had a duke, but she insisted that he go and immediately took up his duties. Casa had clearly forgotten who was paying him, and Anastasia reminded him that conscience was important in such a matter. He had to remember who was keeping him safe. She added that if Casa continues to work like this, no one will be able to protect her if something happens, and this is a very serious problem for her. Anastasia chuckled, noting that his work was not of particularly high quality. She also asked where he was going, since the Duke's office was right in front of them. Casa replied that he did not understand why she was interfering in his affairs. The lady was a little angry. She clearly did not like his behavior. Anastasia felt awkward being alone with the Duke. That's why her indignation was understandable. She wasn't used to such situations. Approaching the door, she knocked, and immediately there was an answer. The Duke invited her in without further ado, as if he already knew that she had come. In the office, he sat on the table, looked at her, and immediately asked what request she had come with. His voice sounded calm, but with a slight hint of interest. Anastasia started talking about the knightly battalion, and then he asked her again in surprise, not understanding what she was talking about. This caused her some confusion. For some reason, the man began to demonstrate everything he could. Anastasia did not quite understand what he wanted to show with this, but it was clearly not part of her plans. She couldn't help but notice how his chest was attracting attention. But she quickly returned to the matter at hand, although it distracted her a little from the important conversation. The Duke confidently said that he had never had knights, which surprised Anastasia. She, with slight bewilderment, asked who was protecting him then. He tried to convince her that there was no need for this, that he did not need protection. However, Anastasia insistently noted that for the upcoming banquet, it was necessary to arrange people correctly. Even if security wasn't needed during normal times, it was necessary for his debut. The area needed to be secured, but he couldn't understand why these people were at the banquet. The lady explained that no one knew how the Toho nobles would act, so it was wise to show strength and intimidate them so that they would not dare to interfere. Better safe than sorry, Anastasia believed, and she believed that such caution was justified. However, the gentleman thought about it, and the lady waited for his answer, realizing that this decision could greatly influence the further development of the situation. Anastasia understood that his thoughts were a typical gesture for someone who is under stress and trying to find the best way out of a difficult situation. But she couldn't understand why the Duke looked so depraved. This look didn't quite fit with his usual demeanor. Thoughts were spinning in her head that right now she could throw everything off her shoulders and do something inappropriate with the Duke. But she quickly pushed the thought away, deciding that she had gone crazy. She was sure that what was happening could not be vulgar, unless this man was sent by the devil of debauchery himself, which seemed unlikely. Anastasia tried to calm down, realizing that she needed to focus on the matter at hand. She needed to somehow hide her confused feelings and return to the matter at hand, and not to these abnormal thoughts. He approached her, noticing that she had a fever, and assumed that she was ill. His concern was obvious, and he touched her skin, feeling its warmth. The lady threw his hand away, deciding that it was not related to the illness. She insisted that everything was fine, but she clearly could not hide her inner uneasiness. To change the subject, she asked how things were with security, hoping that talking about safety would distract him and get them back on track. The Duke, having listened to Anastasia's persistent requests, agreed to place several people in the banquet hall, as she had requested, although he doubted the expediency of this. Anastasia said that if everything continued as it was now, she could not stay here. She was too hurt and decided to run away, saving herself from all these experiences. The Duke was a little surprised by her decision, especially when he remembered the moment when she threw his hand away. With such an expression on her face, he found it difficult to understand her action. The Duke smiled softly. As he recalled the moment, he couldn't help but admit that the situation was complicated, but perhaps that was what was raising the interest in this unusual union. It all looked tempting. The Duke thought that perhaps there was a chance to change everything, if only he could approach the situation correctly and find the right words. When Anastasia left the room, a strange feeling arose in her soul. Everything seemed confusing and unclear to her, as if something did not add up in her thoughts and actions. She couldn't understand what was happening to her. These feelings were not usual, and Anastasia didn't know how to deal with them, since their cause was difficult to understand. Soon the day of the ball arrived, and Anastasia, despite her outward calm, secretly tried to find out as much information as possible about the events that could shock her. But despite her efforts, she never managed to obtain any important information about the alleged murder she was trying to investigate. Everything remained in the shadows. The wait became painful because there was only one thing left to do. Wait. The evening of the upcoming ball promised to be tense, and between the nobles, everything could easily develop into a serious quarrel. Kaisa approached Anastasia and informed her that Gray had given her the dress. The maid, not without a hint of irritation, told him to give it to her personally. Anastasia wondered if Isabella would come. Kaisa noticed that, although it had not yet begun, the girl was clearly tired. This was evident from the expression on her face. There was a heavy look on Isabella's face. Anastasia turned away and reassured her everything would be fine. The makeup would hide all traces of fatigue. Kaisa, noticing that makeup wouldn't cover everything, knew she would now have to seriously start powdering her nose to improve her overall appearance. Anastasia had ordered that Kaisa should not leave. He was to be with her and the Duke today, as they both seemed to be intent on loafing around. Kaisa didn't understand why he should be there, When the Duke was there, Anastasia calmly replied that his presence next to her was his direct responsibility. Casa sighed. Tiredness was taking its toll. He admitted that he was thirsty and asked for some water. The maid who stood nearby excitedly promised to bring water, feeling awkward about how she was attracting Casa's attention. The maid was embarrassed because Casa was indeed very handsome, and despite her confusion, she hastened to fulfill the request. Both the Duke and Casa were not lacking in natural beauty. Casa said with a smile that the lady could now speak, transferring the attention to her. Anastasia had been very worried lately. Khan Itan noticed her tension and decided to find out the reason he expected her to tell the truth. The lady paused for a moment before admitting that she had information about a possible murder, a statement that left everyone puzzled. Khan Itan was shocked and could not believe his ears. He asked again if someone was really dead because the situation seemed too incredible. He thought that the emperor might think she was dead, but Anastasia replied that this was not really the case. There was no real threat to her, but it was a serious matter. Anastasia reported that someone would try to kill the Duke at the gala event today. It was a threat that could destroy everything they had built. The boy was in complete shock. He couldn't believe that the situation was so dangerous and continued to think that the excitement was excessive. However, he was still wary. Anastasia was determined. The killer had to die today without waiting for further events. She felt that otherwise her life would not be safe. However, she also wanted her loyal servant to be by her side. Without him, it would be difficult for her to cope with such a situation, and she could not take any risks. The guy replied that he didn't know how things were with the Duke, but if she was so worried about the situation, he was ready to accompany her to ensure her safety. Anastasia shouldn't worry. She should just play her role. She understands perfectly well that worries only get in the way, but wrinkles are already appearing if she doesn't stop. All the nobility from northern Toho gathered for the event. In anticipation of the celebration, all the guests were in the mood for the evening, especially because his lordship was supposed to appear in the banquet hall. The Duke, noticing Anastasia's absence, asked where she was. Jack, as always, answered reservedly that the lady had conveyed that she would come a little later after his arrival. The butler added that Anastasia had prepared for the evening with special attention. It was her debut, and she was trying to make an impression, so even the butlers were a little worried. Anastasia provided them with support through the Chaos Guild, showing everyone that she would not allow anyone to stand in the way of her dear Duke. She certainly would not allow any interference. The Duke smiled as he watched her actions. He was sure that Anastasia would cope with the role of hostess, but he couldn't help but notice this. Because of her position as a mistress, Anastasia knew that she would be ignored by many nobles, because her status in society did not allow her to count on respect. Despite this, she looked forward to the moment when all these people who looked down on her would be rejected and forgotten. Duke Itan overheard several nobles discussing that this was their first banquet of this level and that they did not expect to see such splendor. However, the Duke himself was not such a simple man, and among the guests was Madame Isabella, who attracted the attention of all those present. Today, she was especially bright and confident. Her gaze shone like never before, which attracted the attention of all the men in the room. All the guests were sure that the Duke could not take his eyes off her, but soon rumors began to circulate about possible changes in the Duke's relationship with Isabella. The rumors they whispered behind her back didn't bother Isabella too much. She simply chuckled and said that it was all nonsense and not worth worrying about. Therefore, many had already begun to think that there was something more between the Duke and Isabella, which put them in an awkward position in front of everyone. There were rumors that the Duke never went out, never met other ladies, and everyone thought that his chosen one was Madame Isabella. Despite these rumors, Isabella always remembered his face, his beauty and refinement, and for her, this was the most important thing. His noble birth, his reputation as a swordmaster, his house full of unique and rare items. All of this was created to remain unique. Isabella was sure that her efforts would not be in vain, that she was to get his heart. And meanwhile, the butler announced that the Duke had arrived. Everyone felt this powerful aura that filled the entire hall. It was something inexplicable, but it was immediately clear to everyone that before them was a man whose fencing skills had reached unattainable heights. He was the only one in the world who was called a true master of the sword. His fighting skills were unmatched, and this inspired awe in even the most experienced warriors. When the crowd saw the Duke himself, many were simply speechless. He was not only a great warrior, but also striking in appearance, reminiscent of the hero of ancient legends. Tall with noble features, a cold but attractive gaze. He was truly magnificent. Isabella could not take her eyes off him. Her heart sank with delight. She instantly decided that this man had to be hers. Such a rare and worthy specimen could not be missed, and she was determined to win his attention. But her resolve wavered when her gaze caught sight of a woman with long black hair in the crowd. What was she doing here? And then the Duke extended his hand to this mysterious lady. A dead silence reigned in the hall. Everyone froze, realizing that this was not just a random person in front of them. And when she was introduced, Isabella experienced a real shock. This woman was still next to the Duke, although in her opinion she should have disappeared from his life long ago. The other girls were also displeased. They immediately began to question Isabella if she knew who this black-haired stranger was and what her connection was with the Duke. The answer came by itself. Anastasia kissed the Duke without further ado. At that moment, everything became crystal clear. There was a much deeper relationship between them. And then the Duke himself, without hesitation, leaned down and kissed Anastasia right on the lips. A shocked silence hung in the hall. No one expected such a turn of events. The men looked at each other in complete bewilderment, completely unable to comprehend what had just happened. Their gazes darted from Anastasia to the Duke, but none of them dared to say anything out loud. Anastasia felt slightly embarrassed, and looking at the Duke quietly reminded him that she had asked him to avoid such actions in public. There was obvious reproach in her voice, but at the same time she tried to remain calm. The atmosphere in the room grew tense, as if the air had become heavier. So Anastasia quickly grabbed his hand, and not giving him a chance to object decisively, led him to the side, away from prying eyes. She made a quick comment about them needing some fresh air, and led him out. Behind them in the hall, the guests began to whisper, discussing her action, and many were now sure that there was something more between them than just a business relationship. Casa remained inside, listening attentively to everything that was said by those gathered. He had already become accustomed to the fact that Anastasia and the Duke often staged such scenes, entertaining the public. But this time the conversation went further. The Count clearly intended to introduce his daughter to the Duke. This gossip had not surprised anyone for a long time. Many had heard about Count Brill's plans, but it seemed that his efforts had been in vain. Everything was not going as he had expected, and the witnesses of today's scene were only strengthened in their suspicions. Isabella was furious. She couldn't believe that some woman would dare lay claim to her Duke. The thought of her plans being ruined made her seethe with anger, and she wasn't going to let it go. As they left the room, Anastasia stopped and turned sharply to him, her eyes sparkling with tension. She demanded what exactly he had just done and why he had done it in front of everyone. The Duke merely chuckled and calmly remarked that he should probably ask her the same question. There was no remorse in his voice, only a slight hint of mockery. After all, she was the one who broke the terms of their agreement in the first place. Her actions attracted too much attention, and now everything has become much more complicated than before. Anastasia was sure that the Duke was now talking about the prohibition of touching someone without mutual consent. It was quite logical, but she did not expect the conversation to go in this direction. Of course, she knew it was her fault for not warning him in advance. She just didn't think it would go this far. Her silence was not taken the way she wanted it to be. The Duke looked at her clearly, not understanding what she was talking about. His gaze showed genuine bewilderment, as if her words were completely illogical to him. He calmly explained that the only difference was that he kissed her on the lips instead of the cheek. In his opinion, it was not something significant enough for her to react so strongly. Apparently, he really didn't realize how important this moment was for her. Besides, Anastasia didn't really resist, and this clearly gave him reason to think that she didn't mind. She asked him directly what he was hinting at. The Duke answered without hesitation. She did not object to his touching, so it suited her. Her heart trembled at these words. Is this really that feeling when you can't stop? When emotions overwhelm you and you can't control yourself anymore? The Duke admitted that this was the first time he had experienced something like this. His voice was firm, but his eyes showed an internal struggle. It seemed that he really loved her. Anastasia was confused. She thought he was just confused about his own feelings, but there was a slight uncertainty in his voice, and that was what made her tell him to stop lying. However, the Duke said he was going to be even more specific. If there had been any doubts before now, he wanted to make everything clear once and for all. He confessed directly. He loved her. Anastasia felt the heat rise to her cheeks. These words made her feel uneasy, and she didn't know what to say. She had absolutely no idea what was going on in his head. How could he talk so calmly about such things when she herself had not yet realized her feelings? Moreover, she could not understand when exactly he had fallen in love with her. If this was true, then why had he agreed to sign the contract in the temple? The Duke calmly replied that he had done so only because he was following her wishes. He personally had no need to enter into this agreement, but he agreed without hesitation. Feelings are not constant. They can become weaker, or on the contrary, stronger over time. Anastasia understood this and believed that the other person should also realize that emotions are fickle. She said outright that she didn't want to take their relationship to another level. For her, it wasn't just a matter of personal comfort, but also professional ethics. She couldn't let her feelings interfere with her duties. Such worries only distracted her from her work, and her affairs required the utmost concentration. As long as he remained close, she had nothing to worry about, because he had made a promise and would undoubtedly keep his word. The Duke was absolutely calm. He saw no reason for doubt and was confident that he would not allow any problems. Everything had to go as he had planned. She admitted that she couldn't know everything, but she was sure of one thing. Rumors about his origins had been circulating for a long time, and she knew what they meant. Duke Itan was not going to let go of the one who occupied his thoughts. He was sure that no matter how the circumstances developed, his beloved would not be able to disappear from his life. He was haunted by the desire to be near her. The constant thoughts about her did not leave him for a minute. This feeling that he experienced in her absence was too strong to ignore. He believed that it was love that made him pursue her so persistently. Anastasia thought otherwise, but perhaps that was the reason she decided to give him a chance. If he talks about love like that, then she wants to see it in action. Mere words weren't enough. She needed proof. The Duke was surprised by her words and asked again what exactly she meant. But Anastasia only replied that he could show his feelings as much as he wanted if they were truly sincere. She didn't want to have any illusions. She needed to make sure that his feelings were real and not just a crush or a passing passion. Anastasia extended her hand to him, on which was a ring of obsidian. She explained that it was a magical artifact that responded to real emotions, changing color depending on feelings for a partner. If the Duke's love was true, the ring would show it. It could not be mistaken, and now everything depended only on himself. The Duke looked at the ring and asked what would happen if it did change color. What consequences would that have for both of them? Anastasia calmly replied that they would make the final decision later, when the right moment came. Now was not the time to rush. Everything had to be thought out. If the Duke showed up unannounced, it would cause a lot of complications. His status obliges him to follow the rules, and a sudden intervention could complicate the situation. But the ring he offered her made everything clear. It solidified her position and made it clear to those around her that he wasn't just making these moves. He seemed to have real feelings. She couldn't help but wonder what he meant when he said those words. He said he loved her, but how true was that? Or was that just part of his plan? But she doesn't have time to think about such things. She knows that love is a fleeting feeling. If she allows herself to feel it, even once the consequences can be unpredictable, she can't afford it, for her love is something unattainable, almost a luxury. She has too much at stake, and unnecessary emotions can lead to danger. Isabella approached Anastasia and asked with a smile how she was doing. They hadn't seen each other for a long time, and apparently the Count's daughter was glad to see her. As soon as Isabella appeared, Anastasia involuntarily sighed. The girl immediately began to speak, admiring how wonderful the ball turned out to be. The Duke seemed to be quite perceptive indeed. Anastasia agreed with a slight smile. Yes, he certainly didn't miss any details. Isabella held out a glass of wine with a smile, offering Anastasia a drink. However, Anastasia did not even reach for the glass, as if she sensed a catch. She did not believe that this gesture was simply a sign of politeness or a friendly treat. Isabella watched her interlocutor closely and suddenly noticed that Anastasia avoided banquets. She was surprised by this and could not resist asking a question. In response, Anastasia calmly explained that she simply had nothing to do there and changed the subject. However, Isabella did not back down. She noted that Anastasia was not particularly beautiful, at least compared to the ladies of high society. She should appear in society more often so that she would not be forgotten, and it could do her some good. Isabella enthusiastically continued to explain that social events are not only about beautiful clothes, but also about pleasant communication. It is extremely important for a true lady to maintain connections, discuss news, and show herself in the best light in front of others. Anastasia listened to these arguments, but did not attach much importance to them. She did not care what the noble ladies thought of her. She thanked Isabella for her concern, turned around, and indifferently turned away, indicating that the conversation was over. Feeling tired, Anastasia apologized, deciding to leave the company. Isabella, on the contrary, was irritated by her behavior. She was not used to such indifference and clearly expected a different reaction. Anger boiled in her soul. But Isabella wasn't going to back down. She believed that sooner or later the truth would come out, and then everyone would know who Anastasia really was. For now, all she could do was wait for the right moment to reveal her true face. When Isabella looked at Anastasia again, she was already holding a glass of wine. However, instead of taking even a sip, she calmly tilted her hand and poured the contents onto the floor. This gesture looked like a challenge. Looking at the spilled wine, Anastasia realized that Isabella had gone too far. She was ready to use even poison to achieve her goal. Such a step meant that her rival was ready for any measures and was not afraid of the consequences. A faint, barely perceptible odor emanated from the glass. It was poison, but not lethal. Most likely it was intended to deprive a person of common sense, to make him vulnerable and pliable. Such a weapon acted unnoticed. Isabella's goal was obviously to make Anastasia behave inappropriately under the influence of the poison. It was a classic, aristocratic trick to disgrace a rival so that everyone could see her fall. Only the plan didn't work. Anastasia was not surprised. If she were an ordinary girl, she would probably drink the offered drink without further thought, but her past experience did not allow her to be so careless. In the past, she was the wife of an emperor, and then she was surrounded by intrigue, betrayal, and danger in every glass of wine. Compared to those times, death by poison seemed the easiest fate. Isabella looked pleased at this point. She suggested that the girls relax and spend the evening in pleasant company, as if nothing unusual had happened. However, despite her expectations, Anastasia did not feel any changes in her condition. She was expecting a trick, but nothing happened, and this even surprised her. If the drink really contained poison, it should have already taken effect. However, Anastasia did not feel the slightest discomfort. This was strange and raised even more questions. In general, Isabella always tried to appear friendly and benevolent, But now during the ball, she did not even try to hide her intentions, as if she had nothing to fear. She didn't even pretend that she hadn't added anything to the drink. It seemed she didn't care whether Anastasia figured it out or not. That was even more suspicious. There was a pleasant, slightly spicy aroma in the living room. It was calm here, and this atmosphere did not hint at danger, but something still did not allow Anastasia to relax. The scent seemed fit for a duke, noble and deep. However, Anastasia could not imagine that it could suit a man like Duke of Itan. Isabella noticed that there was something unusual about the smell. She said that it smelled like an animal, as if something wild was nearby. The other girls also smelled this strange smell. Someone even covered their nose because it was too sharp and thick. Where could it come from? Although the scent was suffocating, everyone felt curious. Where was its source? Isabella glanced quickly at Anastasia, waiting for her reaction. It was obvious that someone was deliberately hiding their nature. If the Duke himself did not come out to them, it meant that he did not want his presence to be revealed. Anastasia understood that he was not so simple. Wherever I go, there are such creatures, she thought. She was sorry that they themselves did not realize their fate. The only way to preserve her honor and pride was to disappear. But before Isabella could take a single step back, Anastasia approached her, not allowing her to retreat. Anastasia calmly but firmly stated that it was about her. Now, she left no room for doubt, pointing directly at the girl. Isabella turned around sharply, clearly indignant. She began to justify herself, assuring that it was not her fault. But Anastasia did not give her time for long explanations and demanded an answer. Isabella, not hiding her contempt, threw offensive words in Anastasia's face, calling her a dirty girl, as if she had previously wandered around the back alleys. Her voice sounded sharp, with a clear hint that she considered her unworthy of being here. The girls around watched the proceedings with undisguised delight, as if they were watching a fascinating performance. They found it funny that some simpleton had suddenly found herself among the aristocrats and was now behaving as if she knew everything and everyone here. Isabella spoke with undisguised contempt about Anastasia, pretending to be a mistress, but in reality her position is worthless. The daughter of a ruined family cannot count on anything more than the role of a mistress at the palace. She didn't believe that someone like Anastasia could become a duchess. It was obvious to her that a mere rag would remain a rag no matter how hard she tried to pass herself off as something more. Anastasia just smiled calmly, not letting her emotions get the better of her. Then, tilting her head, she calmly noticed that right now the rag was in Isabella's mouth. Isabella may have seemed like a nice girl from the outside, but once you heard her speak, it became clear how full of malice and disdain her words were. The way she spoke was simply disgusting. Isabella jumped up from her seat, blazing with rage. She could not believe that this pathetic girl, a descendant of a baron's family, dared to look at her with such defiant arrogance. In anger, she swung her hand, intending to hit Anastasia. But before her palm could reach its target, Anastasia intercepted her hand and squeezed it tightly, firmly, making it clear who was stronger here. Her voice was low and menacing. She warned that she was holding back with all her might from doing something far more drastic. She sounded as if she was seriously ready to rip out her opponent's tongue. Isabella recoiled, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't understand how Anastasia, this insignificant upstart, could dare to speak to her in such a tone and threaten her so openly. But Anastasia did not develop the conflict further. She suggested forgetting about the incident, in the same way as one could forget about the contents of a glass spilled on a tablecloth. All this was not worth attention. However, she made it clear that if Isabella did not change her behavior, the consequences for her next time would be much worse. Isabella, trying to preserve the last of her dignity, smiled and asked if Anastasia really thought she could insult the Count's daughter with impunity. She was sure that her rival would regret such words. Someday, Isabella will make her so angry that Anastasia will tear out her eyes and break her fingers. Such a decision will not be accidental, but carefully thought out. After that, she will throw her out to be fed to the animals. Isabella will not be strong enough to survive in this world, and Anastasia will be glad about that. But if Isabella decides to doubt her power, then let her prepare for the worst. Anastasia will not wait. She will destroy her herself, period. Anastasia hoped that the girl would understand her hint. She was sure that her words could calm her down for a short time, because she was too concerned about her reputation. This really pisses Anastasia off because she's used to her decisions not being challenged. This is clearly not the time to show weakness. The lady suddenly asked what Casa was doing here in this place, and why he had appeared next to her. There was a note of caution in her voice. Casa noted with a grin that he himself had heard the lady tell him to be near the Duke. Although it seemed he didn't need anyone, he had come anyway worried. The lady replied that she was quite capable of dealing with the whims of this baby. After all, she was not just a high-ranking official, but an empress, and this was her duty. Casa noted that she could probably handle 1 or 2 problems, but she should not forget that her academic years were connected with defense and protection. The lady said she found it hard to understand why the boy was so worried, and he replied that he was worried because he was afraid for her safety. He couldn't accept it. She replied that there was no need to worry so much because his job was to protect her. She tried to persuade him to calm down and asked him not to argue, but to follow her. In any case, she doesn't want to continue such jokes. She doesn't understand why he can't understand what she means. It upsets her, but she keeps quiet. If the Duke is under the influence of the paralyzing poison, he will lose the ability to control his thoughts and actions. He will be in a helpless state. The Duke decided to take advantage of the situation. He understood that this was a chance to learn important information that could be useful to him in the future. Everything depended on how he acted. At that moment, his daughter came up to him, and he immediately asked her what had happened. He was worried, not understanding what was happening in her life and why she had come. She was a little confused, but quickly began to say that she wanted to go home. Isabella could not stand Anastasia any longer. Her presence was irritating. Her father was surprised that she decided to return so quickly, but he still agreed. He did not try to convince her, otherwise believing that it was her personal choice. He said he needed to speak to the Duke before returning home. Isabella insisted that her father not linger and end the conversation quickly. The girl didn't want to stay in this place for another minute. Her patience snapped and she was ready to leave. But then she noticed that her father looked puzzled. The father could not understand where the glass of poison that had just been on the table had gone. He looked around, but could not find it, which made him wary. Isabella was standing nearby, and perhaps it was she who took the glass. It could not have been an accident, and her gaze did not give him peace. Duke Itan approached his daughter, Isabella, and his face was full of excitement. He was visibly nervous, his gaze darting around the room. The situation was worrying him. He handed the glass of wine intended for the Duke, but the Duke did not notice where he had placed it. For a few seconds he tried to figure out what to do next. Duke Itan noticed that Anastasia was unusual that evening. Her behavior seemed strange, and her gaze was unfocused. He couldn't understand what exactly was preventing her from being calm, why she was constantly looking around, as if searching for something, and his presence didn't calm her down. Anastasia, feeling his gaze, said a little nervously that she was just embarrassed to dance with him. She had already taken an etiquette course, but she still felt out of place. Deep down, Anastasia felt that she needed to find out where this killer was as soon as possible. After all, not only lives were at stake, but also her reputation. But at that moment the Duke came closer to her, and looking into her eyes, told her not to worry about anything except him. He was sure that all her problems would disappear if she trusted him. Anastasia sighed, but still thought that it would be nice to pretend, at least for a moment, that his words were reaching her, but she still didn't understand why she needed to do it. The Duke, noticing her displeasure, gently ordered her to bend down. He was sure that such behavior would help her concentrate, and perhaps she would begin to trust him more. Anastasia and Itan turned their attention to Isabella, who suddenly tried to hit Anastasia. However, her blow did not reach its target. She missed, Because Isabella missed, she accidentally hit herself. A few steps back, she felt a slight pain from the blow. Anastasia was surprised to see Lady Isabella. She remarked that she should be more careful in her actions, especially in such situations. She hadn't expected Isabella to be willing to go that far. It really surprised Anastasia because she had been sure of something else. Anastasia couldn't understand how Isabella dared to do that. Forgetting all about decency, she simply walked up to her and hit her in the face. Perhaps Isabella was the killer, but Anastasia couldn't be sure. There were too many unanswered questions. However, in reality, it could hardly have been her. After all, in all likelihood, Lady Isabella was against Anastasia and not against the Duke. At that moment, Isabella grabbed Anastasia by the skirt, her face distorted with rage, and her mouth full of insults and dirty words addressed to her rival. Casa immediately ran to Anastasia, his face expressing concern and excitement. He did not know what to do, but he was ready to protect her at any cost. At that moment, glass fragments flew around, and Anastasia was stunned by what was happening. Her reaction was a mixture of surprise and alarm. When Anastasia opened her eyes, her gaze immediately fell on the Duke, who like a protector covered her with himself, shielding her from the dangerous fragments. Despite several wounds, the Duke was not worried about himself. His main concern was whether Anastasia had suffered. She tried to calm him down, telling him to focus on himself and his wounds, but he just waved her off, not wanting her to worry about him. Meanwhile, she noticed his ring began to glow bright red. It reminded her that his care for her ran deeper than she thought. Anastasia couldn't understand why he did that. After all, with his dodging skills, he could easily avoid damage. Why did he take the risk then? But the Duke explained that if he had avoided the blow, she would have certainly suffered. It was his duty to protect her, even at the cost of his own health. Anastasia objected that the Duke was bleeding and needed help. She was ready to act immediately, ignoring his words. She ordered that anchors be brought in and that the wounds be treated immediately. But the Duke again tried to calm her down, claiming that there was nothing to worry about. The lady was outraged and did not understand how he could speak so calmly when his body was literally covered in blood. How could one not worry in such a situation? He, smiling, reassured her, saying that there was no need to worry. He was a master of the sword, and such wounds were not dangerous for him. Everything would be fine. Anastasia, although she did not completely agree with his opinion, still decided to listen to him. He was clearly confident that he could handle it himself. The Duke confirmed that there was no need to worry. At this point, a servant approached them, apparently wanting to know what to do with the woman who was nearby. The servant, awaiting instructions, inquired what they should do with the woman who probably represented some danger or importance to the situation. The services managed to grab Isabella, and in this situation, she still could not stop herself from mocking Anastasia, calling her names. Anastasia was shocked by the situation, not understanding how Isabella could continue her curses despite everything that was happening. Isabella kept screaming that Anastasia had to die, which made Anastasia ask the Duke for permission to deal with her. The Duke agreed to her request, and she immediately asked the servants to release Isabella, giving her a chance for one last meeting. Anastasia also asked for a sword so that she could protect herself if necessary, or act if the situation gets out of control. She decided to give Isabella one chance by asking her if she thought Anastasia, the Duke's mistress, really deserved to die. Anastasia warned that this was Isabella's last chance, and everything she said would be decisive for her future. If Isabella decides that Anastasia must die, she can take up the sword and try to finish what she started. Anastasia noticed that Isabella seemed to be trying to take her place. She felt that this girl was counting on replacing her. And if she thinks she deserves it, then she must apparently be ready to fight for it, because there is no place for the weak here. This made Anastasia very angry, because the young ladies not only insulted her, but also tried to humiliate her, which was completely unacceptable for her. It was especially unpleasant that the ball, which she had worked so hard to organize, was ruined by all these stupid incidents. although in fact she was already ready to leave it without attention. She could not forgive the fact that Isabella dared to harm the Duke. Anastasia didn't understand how she had ended up in this situation. But when Isabella shouted at her not to act like a savage, it made her angry. She couldn't understand why she should be the one to behave with restraint, since ladies weren't supposed to fight with swords, and she didn't agree with that. Anastasia couldn't understand at what point she began to care about the situation with the Duke, because before she hadn't thought about it at all. Then she cut off a couple of strands of Isabella's hair, not expecting that it would lead to such strong irritation on her part. Honestly, if it weren't for her restraint, she could have cut off not only Isabella's hair, but something more serious. At that moment, she didn't even immediately realize that she was close to simply removing her dagger in a fit of anger. But it's interesting that as soon as it comes to approaching from behind, Isabella becomes bold and daring, but she is afraid to fight on equal terms. Anastasia added a little poison to Isabella's glass, turning the other ladies against her in order to increase her influence and convince everyone that her decision was the only right one. However, Isabella did not have the courage to raise her sword, and it did not seem to bother her at all. Her pride did not allow her to admit that she was the weaker in this fight. Anastasia noticed her helplessness, and it irritated her. She was so confident that she started yelling at her without holding back. Anastasia believed that such an insignificant girl as Isabella had no chance of taking a place next to the Duke. She was sure that the Duke would not throw her out. Suddenly, Anastasia thrust the knife sharply in front of Isabella, declaring that she would say it only once. This was supposed to arouse fear and respect in her. She stated outright that Can von Itan was her man, and no one dared question her right to him, even if someone tried to interfere. Anastasia added that if anyone else dared to stand in her way, the consequences would be dire. Her gaze was full of determination. Duke Khan, standing to the side, watched the proceedings with a smile on his face. He found it amusing to see how easily Anastasia controlled the situation. Finally, Anastasia thought that perhaps Isabella had finally realized her mistake. She hoped that the girl would understand all the consequences of her behavior. As Isabella began to leave, she suddenly grabbed the sword and threw it towards Anastasia, as if by accident, but clearly with the intention of showing something. Anastasia was in complete shock. She quickly turned around, and at that moment, she heard a strange sound that made her feel that something had happened. Turning around, she saw the sword pierce Isabella's shoulder. The whole scene was frightening and unexpected, but the moment proved fatal for the girl. At that moment, everyone realized that this was the act of the Duke, who was trying to protect Anastasia, acting instinctively but extremely decisively. Isabella began to scream, begging the Duke not to do it, but her words had no power when the Duke continued to stand with such a determined look. He answered her in a cold tone that he was very sorry, but he had not managed to kill her with the first blow, which was evidence of his intentions. The whole situation was simply absurd. The Duke did not hesitate and dealt with Isabella with surprising speed without showing any emotion. Isabella could not believe that the Duke, with whom she had been in contact for so long, had treated her so cruelly. She was in complete hysterics. In desperation, she began to beg the Duke to spare her. She begged him on her knees to let her go, realizing that the situation had become critical. She begged for mercy, but the Duke did not change his mind and had already raised his weapon, preparing to deliver the decisive blow. However, Anastasia intervened. Anastasia, seeing what was happening, said that she had enough. She asked the Duke to stop without bringing the situation to the extreme. The hall was in chaos. The nobles were shocked and panicked, not understanding how everything could have gotten out of control so quickly. Anastasia stood watching what was happening, not knowing what to do. The Duke, covered in blood, continued to stand, showing no sign of emotion. Everything that was happening reminded her of a picture from a dream she had recently seen. She realized that it was not just a dream, but a premonition of what was to happen. The gentleman intervened and expressed his displeasure, calling the behavior of the Toho nobles a real disgrace. They could not greet Lord Itan himself like that. The gentleman turned out to be Count Thor von Guardian. The northern lands clearly did not appeal to the locals, and many were surprised that this particular duke was singled out. He noted that all of this was just part of an unnecessary show, and that, of course, it was not worth doing, and it was not done for nothing. The duke himself was involved in this matter, and one of the noblewomen from the central lands decided to behave in this way. She clearly did not understand the consequences. And here, as if to add insult to injury, all this was happening right in front of the duke himself. For a northern nobleman like him, it was especially humiliating. It was impossible to simply ignore such manipulations from the central lands. It required a response to demonstrate its strength and resilience. He could have remembered that he was always ready to be the duke's sword, if he so desired. His support was not empty words. As soon as the northern gentleman returned, he immediately congratulated him on this event. He was glad to have returned to his native land, ready for new challenges. Another lady, noticing his return, greeted the master of the North people, began to gather, who also expressed their respect and admiration. Congratulations on the duke's arrival began to multiply, and Anastasia could not hide her joy. It all looked as if she too had received recognition. At some point, absorbed in what was happening, he suddenly remembered the ring. Its color had changed, and this was important, although at first glance, it might have gone unnoticed. Now it was the lady's turn. He was looking forward to this moment, realizing that everything would soon change, and events would develop rapidly. The heart that had been calm before suddenly began to beat faster. He felt the tension rising, causing his heart to beat twice as fast. Duke Dukan was too greedy. He had long ago begun to show his interest in the affairs of the empire, and apparently his grandfather occupied an important position in politics. The entire royal family and nobility looked up to Dukan alone. His influence was so strong that they could not take a step without his approval. It was hard to understand why Count Brill had been sent to spy on the Duke. The decision seemed strange and ill-founded, but such was the will of the higher powers. What he planned to do with Duke Brill also remained a mystery. He seemed too old and wise for such games, and his actions were beginning to seem ridiculous. Duke Dukan most likely believed that this way he could test his strength by pushing others to action, forcing them to react to his moves. That's why he sent someone he thought was unimportant to get hidden information about the Duke. He was willing to take risks regardless of the consequences. This situation could be an opportunity to persuade the North to unite. He hoped that other dukes and nobles would understand how important solidarity was for the future of the empire. Having found himself in this game, Duke Dukan clearly had his sights set on his goal, since he allowed himself to treat Duke Itan with such disrespect. Draft noticed how they were openly provoking Itan, trying to get him mad. Something had to be done quickly, but Itan hated politics. The Count then said that he could not simply ignore what was happening, pretending that nothing had happened. He had to go to the capital and sort out the situation. The Count also noted that he did not seem to understand how much the North opposed the center. In these lands, they had been fighting for their freedom and land for centuries. The land in the North is not as fertile and prosperous as the capital. However, Northerners are proud of their homeland and their independence, despite the difficulties. The center sees Northerners as mercenaries who help guard an important border. They are considered necessary to ensure security. Despite this, they do not refuse their military and financial assistance. Such allies are needed, but relations with them are still complicated. Because of this, the center deliberately introduces high taxes for Northerners. They must pay for their role in protecting the borders and maintaining order. After the war, the population in the North was greatly reduced. This makes the situation worse, as there are fewer and fewer people. The nobles of Toho have begun to marry ladies from the central territories. These marriages are intended to strengthen ties and transfer power to the North in the future. From such alliances, the influence of the central region on the North becomes stronger. This is a strategic decision that will bear fruit over time. Duke Itan noted that Dukan was a truly intelligent and far-sighted man. His strategies surprised many times. Then the Count, after some thought, mentioned that his mistress could become a symbol of the female power of the North. She is not just a beautiful woman, but an example for others. Her will and spirit are not simple, and in this he saw real strength. Therefore, the Count thought it would be wise to marry her, to emphasize her importance. The Duke noticed that the conversation had strayed a little from the point and suggested concentrating only on the important and necessary issues. He wanted everything to be said to the point. Kraft, unable to stand the pause, decided to ask where the Duke was headed. He was interested in where he was going. To this, the Duke calmly replied that his target was Anastasia. He felt that he needed to speak to her about an important matter. Hearing this, the Count was surprised that someone in such a state would go to a woman and suggested that the Duke at least wash himself before the meeting. However, the Duke ignored his remarks, saying that it was none of the Count's business. The Count was shocked by such disdain. The Duke also expressed curiosity as to whether the woman had survived. The Count confirmed that she had, and the Duke merely recalled how he had cut off her hand. Can ordered that she be put in a coffin and sent back. He was sure that Dukan would understand everything. He was not a fool, and this situation would not raise any questions. At this time, the Duke was taking a bath. Absorbed in his thoughts, he called Anastasia to him to discuss an important matter. When Anastasia entered, she asked in surprise if it was strange that he was taking a bath at a time when they should have been discussing business. The Duke calmly replied that everything was fine, and she could leave without worrying. He was sure that nothing unusual was happening. He noted that perhaps such actions might be inconvenient for her, but Anastasia only said that she had brought him ointment for relief. The Duke replied that the ointment would certainly help, but the wounds would heal on their own. He was not particularly concerned about their condition. Anastasia believed that the ointment would speed up the healing. Then he suggested that she apply it because he trusted her skills, but she didn't agree. She said she didn't see the point in it, especially in the bathroom. She thought he could handle it himself. The Duke reminded her that he had protected her and dealt with the woman. Seeing her hesitation, he insisted, and Anastasia agreed to help. She took the ointment and asked where exactly he was hurt, ready to help him with his wounds. Despite her doubts, the Duke enthusiastically began to show the places where he was injured, and first of all, he pointed to his face, showing a small scratch. Anastasia asked him to sit still, as she focused on his wound and wanted to do everything carefully. As she began to carefully apply the ointment to the wound, their eyes met, and a moment of indescribable tension passed between them. The Duke, a little embarrassed, asked her if she thought it was unnecessary and somewhat superfluous. Anastasia, thinking he was referring to the lady they had just been talking about, replied that the woman had definitely gotten what she deserved. The Duke asked why the lady had not killed her, because although he had forgotten that he had done wrong, it was only a childish misdeed. He was testing her reaction. Anastasia replied that there was no point in killing for her. Even if she wanted to, it would not bring her anything. Sometimes, of course, she would like to do so, but deep down she knew that she would not do it. It would be too radical for her. The Duke noticed that there were many dead on the battlefield, and those people were the same as her, so it wasn't all that unexpected. The lady did not immediately understand what he was getting at, and he explained that the enemy has no gender, and one's actions can always be justified. For him, killing was nothing more than a necessity for survival in a cruel world where weakness could not be allowed. As a child, no one looked after him or monitored him, so he learned to cope with difficulties on his own without expecting help from others. The lady thought that he was probably making excuses and trying to convince her that she did not understand the reasons for his actions. She found it a little cute. The Duke was sure there was nothing unusual in his actions and could not understand why she was laughing. Anastasia said it was simply amazing. She admitted that it was not a surprise, although it seemed strange, because in the end, he turned out to be completely different from what she expected. The Duke was slightly taken aback. He knew, of course, that she saw him differently, but now he wanted to capture her attention even more. The Duke caught Anastasia's attention at first sight. Every smile he gave her made her blush, despite her attempts to maintain her composure. However, he was in no hurry. He knew that she would eventually be his, and there was no need to rush. He was confident of his success. He was patient and ready to wait. He knew that sooner or later, Anastasia would be his, and it was only a matter of time. One day, Anastasia confessed to him that all this might seem strange, but she felt that there was something more to their relationship. She was surprised that it turned out he wasn't that perfect either. He didn't have that special something she expected. No one could understand why she had such a strong reaction to him. It was something new and unusual. At some point, he suddenly grabbed her hand and dragged her into his bathroom. Anastasia was shocked by this turn of events. She couldn't understand what he was like, what kind of crazy things he was doing. She asked him what was going on. He gently brought his face close to hers and said that he could not hold back any longer. It was too much desire. He asked her to sleep with him, promising to be gentle and caring. The words sounded confident, but Anastasia did not know how to react to this. Anastasia, in turn, was surprised by his frankness and asked him why he always said such indecent things. The Duke replied that she should not bother with formalities. He considered that it was unnecessary, and that all this was just unnecessary words. He assured her that she felt the same way he did. It wasn't just a business relationship. There was something more between them. He tried to explain that their relationship was already going beyond the call of duty, and that this feeling could not be ignored. Anastasia tried to understand what she really felt. Her inner experiences were becoming more and more confused. He hoped that she was not really against his proposals. All he needed was confidence in her feelings. He hoped that she would not find his behavior offensive, and that she would be able to accept him for who he was. Perhaps from their very first date, Anastasia began to have some feelings for the Duke, although she did not realize it at first. However, there was no place for love in her life. Every day was full of struggle, and she did not allow herself to think about feelings. She was an illegitimate child who was used and abandoned, and her mother was beheaded by her husband. This left deep scars on her. Anastasia has gone through so many hardships that she has become strong and hardened. She has been fighting for survival all her life and has no right to weakness. Because of the constant threat to her life, she can't be a normal girl. Many reasons make her stay away from him, but something about him caught her attention. She could no longer deny her feelings, which grew with each passing day. She admitted that he was right, and admitted to herself that she was drawn to him, despite all her internal barriers. Unable to hold back any longer, she kissed him. He was too handsome, and if it was just for one night, she didn't care. She wanted it. She wanted to have him completely, including his thoughts and desires, in order to be close to him, at least a little. But as soon as her thoughts returned to the beginning of their meeting, she felt embarrassed and hesitant. She asked him for a minute to compose herself. The Duke did not understand her strange behavior and thought it was too cruel to end at such a moment. She explained that that was not the case and invited him to go to her bedroom. The gentleman, of course, could not refuse her request and readily picked up Anastasia in his arms. He gently carried her to the bedroom, carefully holding her in his arms. He took off her wet dress, his fingers sliding over the fabric. He couldn't even imagine that one day Anastasia would end up on his bed. It was like some kind of dream. He had never imagined that they would be so close before. And now he was next to her, and it was perhaps the most amazing moment of his life. He wanted her to look him straight in the eye, so that there would be no distance between them. He hoped that she would feel what he felt and not be distracted. He hoped that her thoughts would be occupied only with him and nothing else, so that she could fully absorb his attention and understand how important this moment was for him. He wanted her to think only about him and what was happening between them, for her feelings to be pure and real. Everything else didn't matter at that moment. They continued kissing, and suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, she stood up. He couldn't understand what was happening, Everything seemed so natural, but now the situation had changed. He noticed that they were in the middle of it when she suddenly stood up. He felt himself getting hot. It was hard to understand, but he tried to focus on her. He continued to do everything he could to make things right. He was sure that he had to do things the way she wanted, and he hoped that she would be pleased with his efforts. She asked him not to move, but to continue kissing her. As before, she was in that state where every touch of his was important to her, and she didn't want him to stop. The Duke himself did not know that kisses from his beloved woman could be so delightful. He felt so alive that he could not stop enjoying this moment. But suddenly, without warning, he began to rise. He didn't know what had made him do it, but she was afraid, and he sensed her anxiety. He froze. She told him to stay where he was and not to move. But he did not listen to her, and a question arose in his heart. Was he doing the right thing by not violating her request? She told him that he shouldn't do anything until they were sure of what they were doing. But he couldn't understand why he wanted to continue and not stop there. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more. He was sure that he would not only stop, but he also didn't know if he had the strength for more. He asked her to be easy because he really couldn't control himself at that moment. His emotions were out of control, and it was too much for him. The lady was embarrassed and felt her body weaken. She saw his persistence reflected in his eyes, and she knew she couldn't continue any further. There is nothing stronger than me, he thought, leaving his marks on her body. His desire did not fade, but on the contrary, it only became stronger and more obsessive. It was madness. The lady liked it, and despite her inner struggle, she couldn't help but give in. It seemed she had broken his defenses, and now he couldn't hold back. After a while they were almost finished, but she, exhausted, said she could not do it anymore. Tired, she felt her strength leaving her. But the Duke disagreed with her words and said that the night had only just begun. She must understand this, otherwise she would not see the full extent of what he intended to do. She couldn't understand why he was saying this, but he laid her back on the bed, still insisting on his way. She felt her resistance melt away. She asked him to wait, but he did not listen to her requests. The night went on, and his desire was stronger than her words, stronger than her doubts. After the Duke's death, some time later, in a place accessible only to him, he found his grandfather's old diary. It was a place where the most hidden thoughts were kept. As his death approached, the magical power gradually weakened. In this process, he began to see Duke Itan, not just as a successor, but as something greater, more significant. He began to realize that this young man was his real grandson. And with each passing day, the understanding of this connection became deeper and more meaningful to him. It was then that he realized that his son had died, never having found happiness along with his beloved. And now his grandson had inherited not only magic, but also deep trauma. The guy, oddly enough, did not even understand human emotions. It seemed that the whole world was empty and alien to him. He did not know how to perceive these feelings. Grandfather, watching him, felt the weight of guilt. He felt that he could have done more to raise him and heal his inner pain, but it was too late. Although his grandfather was able to escape the curse, he was right to save his marriage. But despite this, he never knew true love in his life. The Duke seemed content with his life. He closed the diary, keeping its pages hidden from everyone. Perhaps this was his way of letting go of the past. Previously, he had two paths before him. In order not to go mad from the curse, he was forced to suppress his emotions, to pretend that nothing was happening. Since childhood, he had been taught to hold back, not to show his feelings. It was the only way to survive. He hoped that he could withstand this test. He said he didn't want to live like his grandfather. The first solution was to suppress his emotions and live like him, so as not to lose control of himself. The second path was darkness like his father's, to go mad and leave without a trace. This was not what he wanted, but he knew no other way out. If he didn't learn to control his emotions, he would suffer the same fate as his father. He didn't want to become a copy of what had come before. He decided to refuse his grandfather's offer. Even if his life was short, he wanted to feel alive, and not like a walking dead man. He wanted to feel life, especially in moments when his beloved woman was nearby. In her presence, something changed in him. He felt real. Of course, he wanted to save this moment, not to lose it. He tried to save everything he could, but fear sometimes clouded his mind, not allowing him to relax. But he doubted whether he could trust this girl. He had always been wary of everyone, and now his feelings were even more confused. He didn't know if she could be someone he could confide in. His attitude was cautious. He didn't know what to do with this feeling. Suddenly, he saw himself as a small person. He thought that perhaps, in offering trust, he was taking a risk, relying on luck rather than reason. He thought that maybe the guy just didn't like her, that her affection wasn't genuine. It left him feeling unsure. But the boy at his young age said he didn't know. But he wondered if his older self was afraid of that same uncertainty. The Duke smiled, assuring him that he had nothing to fear. He seemed completely calm, as if nothing could disturb him at that moment. The boy, however, did not share his confidence. He pointed his finger into the distance where his father stood and said that he would end his life just like him. He said that her life would most likely end up like his father's if she continued to follow him. This was his vision of the future. The guy continued that in such a situation, it would be best to seal him. Otherwise, he would not be able to find peace and would continue to suffer. This will give him a chance to live a normal life without fear and pain, without unnecessary worries about what might happen to this person. The Duke, hearing these words, asked again if the boy really thought that it was so easy to give up everything that surrounded them. The boy was struck by the fact that the Duke seemed not to care about the woman's life. It seemed strange and unnatural to him, as if he did not notice the importance of her fate. The Duke replied that his life and feelings should not concern the boy, and the fact that he was worried about Anastasia's fate did not matter at all in this situation. The boy said with determination that the Duke was lying. He was convinced that the woman shared his mother's fate, and that was the only reason for his concern. He was sure that if Anastasia found out his secret, she might reject him. This made him worry about her future. But the Duke was sure that everything would be different with Anastasia. He was convinced that she was not like other people, and her fate would not be the same. He kept saying that all people were the same. But Anastasia, in his opinion, was special. She was not like everyone else, and that changed everything. The boy thought to himself that perhaps he was simply in love with her. This explained his actions, and he could not find another answer. The Duke, smiling, confirmed his thoughts. The boy, however, fell silent, embarrassed because even he himself did not know what true love was. He couldn't understand how he could be so sure that he was feeling something he had never felt before. It seemed as if the emotions he was experiencing were completely new to him. The Duke asked again if he really couldn't hear, like he couldn't understand what they were saying to him, trying to figure out what was happening. When the Duke held her, his heart began to beat so hard that it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. He felt that this was something special, something that could not be ignored. He thought it was love, but the guy advised him not to try to copy other people's behavior, not to look for meaning in what they were experiencing. He too was ready to go mad and die, like all those who had gone before him. However, the Duke nodded and said that if this was his fate, she was ready to accept it. He was ready to do this rather than leave Anastasia. He could not give her up, even if he had to go against his will. The boy was silent for a moment, and then quietly said that she was saving him, and therefore perhaps she was destined to die. The Duke became angry, demanding that the boy leave and never return. He did not want to hear a word, considering it all ridiculous. He didn't need saving, because he had already received everything he needed. Now he wanted to understand what was behind what was happening between them. What was happening between them was something strange and mysterious. He felt a desire to understand what kind of feeling they were experiencing. The Duke turned to Anastasia and said that his curiosity was now satisfied, but he was still not sure that her curiosity was the same. He couldn't be sure of her feelings, so he simply hugged her while she slept, unable to get rid of his doubts and questions. Jack was in shock, screaming that they would never have another chance like this. All the butler's hopes were shattered, and he felt that all was lost. This lady was ruining all his dreams, and he was angry with the Duke. If it weren't for him, he would have taken her head himself without thinking twice. He also overheard the maids discussing where Mistress Anastasia had been the day before. This was information that troubled him and gave him no peace. Anastasia always stood out for her confidence, especially when she managed to take revenge on that lady. They continued their conversations about the Duke, not forgetting his greatness. Word spread quickly. All the nobles knelt before the Duke, and it was a sign that they were perfect for each other. The butler could not help but notice how at that moment Anastasia showed her cunning and charm, like a real fox manipulating the situation. At that moment, one of the maids approached the butler, and he asked her with interest what had happened, because something was clearly happening. She said with a smile that Mrs. Anastasia had asked her to convey something important. The butler became wary, waiting to see what would happen next. The maid handed him a jar of ointment and said it was an excellent remedy for back pain. The butler, somewhat surprised, asked if it really was from the mistress. The maid, without embarrassment, explained that Anastasia herself had taken care of the ointment and paid attention to the maids. This surprised the butler, but he said nothing. She added with sincere admiration how the lady had taken care of her when she had been hurt. Anastasia had cured her herself and said that this could happen to anyone. The maid admitted that she was very happy that Anastasia had appeared in their house, because she was always ready to support. However, the butler was not as happy as everyone else. The entire estate was delighted with Anastasia's appearance, and the servants admired her abilities. The butler felt only bewilderment and slight anxiety. Anastasia became like a fox, captivating everyone around her, and even the butler could not remain indifferent, observing her influence. In the morning, Anastasia finally woke up, feeling a strange feeling of fatigue and pain in her body. Not understanding what exactly was bothering her. She tried to remember what had happened that night, but it took her a moment to realize why her body ached. Memories of that man came back and she felt a little embarrassed. Even if she hadn't managed to seduce him, it was still something important to her. Anastasia began to think that perhaps even if she couldn't win his heart, she would still inevitably fall in love with him. Meanwhile, the Duke approached Anastasia and noticed that she had finally woken up, although she looked a little surprised by her awakening. She looked at him and quietly asked how long he had been watching her. He asked her to just continue to rest and not to worry. Anastasia didn't quite understand what the Duke was talking about when he said that the pain would last for several days. This left her puzzled. The Duke carefully picked her up, explaining that this was what the doctor had said. Anastasia felt a strange uneasiness from his words. The girl was surprised, but tried not to think about how the Duke could discuss her condition with the doctor. It was not a pleasant moment for her. She thought that maybe they had just gotten too carried away, lost track of time, and that had led to this outcome, but she wasn't sure. He seemed a little worried, asking if everything was okay. After all, the doctor said that after a warm bath, she would feel much better. To make her feel better, he prepared a bath with rose petals for her. Anastasia, not expecting this, asked if she could ask him a question. The Duke was pleased by her interest and, slightly embarrassed, asked what she wanted to know. He was ready to answer, but he did not know that her question would be like this. Anastasia looked at him carefully and asked if he had ever been close to women. It was an unexpected question, but she was interested. The Duke was surprised to hear such a question and replied that he was curious why she was asking that question, especially after he had been so helpless yesterday. Anastasia hastened to assure him that this was not the case at all. She simply did not understand how he could be so good if this was his first experience. She couldn't help but notice how his body moved with such slowness and grace, and his face was surprisingly pleasant, which made her feel special. She said quietly that it had been a really nice first time, and her words carried not only gratitude, but also a slight surprise at what was happening. The gentleman was genuinely surprised by the lady's words when she said that her ex-husband had never touched her. It hurt him, but he did not ask any unnecessary questions. She confessed that she had never experienced true love. The Duke thought about it. He knew that it was incomprehensible to her, as if love did not exist for her. He noticed that the lady was too proactive, which could be due to the fact that this was her first experience. This made him wary, but also intrigued at the same time. The lady blushed and confessed that she did not know what love was. This seemed to him both naive and touching, as if she was just beginning to explore the world of feelings. The Duke remarked that he liked it. He thought that she had more questions, and perhaps she did not fully understand everything that was happening between them. But the lady, with interest in her eyes, wondered if he could answer all the questions she wanted to ask. It was a test for her to check his knowledge. The Duke smiled and replied that he was capable of answering anything she asked him. But he warned her that this man, despite his answers, could be dangerous to her heart. The lady, coming out of the bath, said that it was not just a one-night stand. She felt that she liked it, and perhaps this feeling was not one-sided. The Duke was truly magnificent. His body was in perfect shape. It could not fail to impress, and she could not hide her admiration for his physical attractiveness. The servants' rumors said that he was secretive and did not like to reveal his secrets. This was her perception, but she understood that there was something more behind this secrecy. Now she could understand what this secrecy meant to him. It was not just privacy, but rather an attempt to protect himself from the outside world, to maintain his personal space. Come to think of it, she knew almost nothing about him. She could only judge by his appearance and rumors, but his origins remained a mystery to her, as did his skill in combat. Anastasia had long believed that Duke Itan was a cruel and unfeeling man, but she soon realized that he had a caring side. It was hard to understand what kind of life he had lived, but it was clearly not an easy existence. Anastasia's curiosity grew. She wondered what secrets the Duke was hiding. Then she noticed a strange mark on her neck. It was a bite, which only added to the questions. The song she heard remained a mystery to her. However, looking back at herself, Anastasia realized that her entire neck was covered in hickeys, which confused her even more. In desperation, she screamed, accusing the Duke of being a complete idiot. But standing in front of the mirror, she saw that the Duke had also been given hickeys, which seemed to give him a sense of victory. Unfortunately, her master could not find the words to explain the situation, because according to him, the points were dead, and this changed everything that had previously seemed obvious. Anastasia realized that with such a terrible outcome, she would not be able to get married, because due to the loss of her arm, her situation became absolutely hopeless, and all her plans collapsed. She began to think that she would no longer be of any use to the family. Her fate had become unprofitable, and now her life and her family was doomed to nothing. However, he suddenly noticed that she had stopped breathing, and this caused him horror. He realized that something was wrong, and his anxiety increased. In a panic, he pulled her out of the coffin and anxiously asked if she was okay, not understanding what had happened. Everything that was happening seemed extremely strange and inappropriate. He was sure that all this had been planned by the Duke, and that he had sent her here for his own reasons. This thought tormented him, but he did not know how to cope with it. Anastasia said that what happened to her was a warning from the Duke. Everything that happened was part of his game, and now she understood that it was all planned. In search of the truth, she asked her father if the Duke had really ordered him to leave their lands and come here. Her father confirmed her suspicions that it was the Duke's order. She blamed the Duke for what was happening, believing that he had never expected things to go this far. He could have avoided this development, she believed, but now there was nothing to be done. Isabella looked terrifying, but her words were calm. She remarked that it was simply magnificent, and added that it was the result of care that hurt. It seemed that she had no intention of being offended by the Duke. Isabella kept her cool and showed no signs of displeasure, despite the whole situation. And judging by her reaction, she didn't know that it was her father who put poison in the wine, which brought her some relief. This allowed the Duke to relax a little. The Duke hugged his daughter, feeling deep pain for her. He said with sincere regret that he was very sorry that she had found herself in such a situation. He added that he would never allow anyone to hurt her like that again, assuring her that he would continue to protect her no matter how difficult it was. The Duke was soon informed that Lady Brill had returned home safely. This news calmed him down a little and brought some clarity to the current situation. It seems that everything went according to plan to fulfill the Duke's hidden intentions. Some important steps were completed, and everything was handed over with due care. The Duke, delighted by the good news, said everything was indeed excellent, but added that developments needed to be monitored further. However, the young man still could not understand where Hyde had disappeared to, because he had not been seen for quite some time, which made him anxious. The Duke replied that Hyde had gone on holiday, which was a bit of a surprise to someone who was used to working non-stop. The reasons remained a mystery. The guide, not understanding such a decision, objected that why would one suddenly do that? He considered it unacceptable and disrespectful to the matter. The Duke calmly stated that he felt no need to account for his decisions, adding that it was his own business, and he did not owe anyone an explanation for his actions. He also noted that if the boy continued to complain, he would have to bury him alive, as he put it, and noted that the gentleman had a mistress. The guy, with surprise, learned about this from those who recently saw him off to graduation. The Duke confirmed the information that it was true, and it was a familiar fact for him. The boy continued to question her and asked if she was really beautiful. The Duke, smiling, replied that she was pretty, although he was surprised that this girl was Ian's lover. Duke Itan turned to Ian Kutar, asking if he truly believed he had any choice in the matter. His gaze was stern, his voice firm. Ian quickly replied that everything was fine, and that he just wanted to survive. The Duke looked at him and said that there was no point in wasting time on unnecessary thoughts. He just needed to do what he was told. The Duke added that Ian should not pay any more attention to his mistress, no matter how much it attracted his attention. He should focus on more important things. Ian, despite the instructions, couldn't help but think about the woman who had caught his attention. In the desert, his thoughts were occupied with survival. But now everything was different. His interest in women did not disappear. Meanwhile, Anastasia returned home. She was once again in the spotlight after returning from her business. Her return did not go unnoticed, and everyone waited for her instructions. The woman who seduced the Duke became the topic of discussion among everyone. Her figure was shrouded in many rumors, and everyone tried to understand what kind of person was hiding behind her mysterious image. The current Duke of Itan's parents left him when he was only 8 years old. By the decision of the previous Duke, he was sent abroad for a long time. It was a difficult period in the life of young Itan, and he did not see his parents for a long time. However, beyond this information, nothing more is known about the Duke. He did not talk about his family, and others could not provide details about his past. The mystery of his life remained unsolved. No one knew about him and his past, so the lady was completely surprised to learn about it. All her questions about the Duke remained unanswered, and her interest only grew. She couldn't understand how it was that no one knew anything about the Duke. All this made her think perhaps she should ask him directly about his life and secrets. However, she doubted whether he would give her an honest answer. At first, she thought that it had nothing to do with her affairs, and she decided to leave the subject without attention. But now she was worried about something bigger. Who was this man? What was his family hiding? Why was his past so carefully hidden? She felt she had to get to the bottom of it. She wanted to know if all the women of the Itan family really suffered. As rumors said, this thought did not give her peace, and she decided to try to uncover the secrets of this family. And then at some point she noticed something strange. Her aura, her feelings, everything seemed unusual. She couldn't understand what was happening and decided to focus on the situation. Turning around, she saw a group of men standing nearby. At first, she thought they were killers, but quickly realized that they did not look like what she expected. In addition, one of the men approached her, covered her mouth, and showed her a sign that said they were not murderers, but people with another goal. She felt relieved, but still wary. She still didn't understand what was going on. The men looked scruffy, and the cards said not to scream. They claimed they were there to make a deal, but she found it hard to believe. The faces of these people were tired like scouts, and she immediately thought that they might be Hyde's scouting party. Her suspicions turned out to be true, and she realized that she was dealing with a serious situation. These people offered her their terms. They wanted her to leave whenever she wanted, and offered 3 shifts in exchange for a vacation. But she wasn't sure whether to agree to such terms. Anastasia said that she heard their words, but wanted to understand what she would receive in return for her cooperation. The men told her that she would receive information about the Duke, and she asked if they could really provide such information. They confirmed that the Duke had given permission, and that she would only receive the information she needed after the agreement was signed. Anastasia was surprised that the Duke asked for permission. He agreed to leak information, but everything would depend on her decision, which she would make after the agreement. She couldn't understand how the Duke had found out about her investigation, so she said she was forced to agree to their terms. Because of this, she agreed, and expressed a desire to find out if the rumor about the psychological problems of the Itan family was true. The men said that this would be her first question. Anastasia realized that the question was too direct and immediately attracted attention. After a short consultation, they replied that this was not the case. Men have selfishness, but they are devoted to love, although this creates great side effects. They added that they want to receive as much love as they give, and this is calculated on a deep level. They believed that the problem was their excessive honesty and desire to get more and more, and this also applied to the Duke, who was a lonely and misunderstood man. The men placed their hands on the table in front of her, but she did not understand what this gesture meant in the context of their conversation. They informed her that the response was complete, and she now had to fulfill her obligations, which meant that her decisions were final, and everything was under her control. She, in turn, agreed to provide them with the necessary conditions, and this concession of hers made them happy because they knew that she always kept her promises. When they left, they began to quickly move away. Although they did not say anything important, at the end, they only expressed their sympathy and declared that they loved her, which left a strange feeling. The Duke sent his reconnaissance team, as he had promised earlier, specifying that he was ready to answer any questions she wanted to ask and provide any necessary clarifications. This could have been done to demonstrate trust in her, since the intelligence group was an important part of his power and the information he used to make decisions. Such attention from the Duke was slightly touching, because his intelligence service, despite its strictness, seemed something personal and important to him, that he trusted it. The guy standing next to him was in complete shock because all his colleagues were going on vacation, and he had to work alone, which seemed unfair and sad to him. The Count, turning to the Duke, expressed a request for a meeting, arguing that this matter required immediate discussion, but the Duke, as usual, simply said that he was too lazy to do so. In response to the Count's request, the Duke suggested that his butler pass on the information and say that the Count could come to him in the afternoon, hoping that this would resolve the situation. However, the Duke's master noticed that the butler must have gotten hurt somewhere, since his behavior seemed somewhat unusual, which suggested a possible injury or trouble. The Duke had a backache, and he used the remedy Anastasia gave him. She was always ready to help, giving useful medicines. He knew that he could trust her. The Duke was a little surprised and asked why she decided to give him medicine. He was not used to such care and was slightly puzzled by her action. The butler explained that Anastasia gave medicine not only to him, but also to other servants. She took care of everyone so that no one would suffer from minor ailments. He didn't think she wanted anything in return. He thought her action was an act of kindness, but the Duke couldn't understand why she did it. The butler wondered if this meant that Anastasia really did care about him. He couldn't be sure, but something about her actions made him think so. He wasn't entirely sure if she cared about him, but he couldn't deny that it felt good to have someone think about you. It was a new feeling for him. Anastasia clearly knew how to touch people. Her actions sometimes seemed unexpected, but always evoked a response in the hearts of those who knew her. She was special. The Duke was lost in thought, and the butler stood by, not knowing what to do. The situation was not entirely clear, and he did not know how to react. He said that if the Duke had no more business, he had to go on his own business. The butler was ready to leave him, unless there were other instructions. The Duke nodded and said that from now on he would be more attentive to Anastasia. Her actions and words now seemed more important and meaningful to him. The butler was a little scared when he heard this. He knew that the Duke could be unpredictable, and he was not sure that he could handle the Duke's new attention. When Anastasia entered, she greeted Jack. She had a beautiful bouquet of flowers in her hands and looked somehow special, as if she was preparing for an important meeting. The butler thought that perhaps the lady was going out somewhere. After all, she usually spent her days in her room, and such behavior seemed unusual to him. But Anastasia replied that she wasn't going to go anywhere. She was just feeling a little dizzy and decided to go out into the fresh air for a little walk. He thanked her for helping him with the ointment, which really helped him. He was truly grateful for her care and attention to his condition. The lady said not to worry, everything would be fine. However, she was wrong, because his communication with people could have played a role. If he gave something, it was odorless. Anastasia planned to hand it over to the maid separately, so there was no need to worry. Everything had to be done carefully without unnecessary worries. She wished him luck in his work because it was time for her to leave. Time was not standing still, and she felt that she had to move on. But the butler suddenly turned to her again. He asked Anastasia to take care of the Duke. It was important to him. Anastasia was surprised by his request and replied that if he did not trust her, he would hardly understand why she would help him with this at all. She barely knew the Duke. Sometimes she wonders if the Duke is really like other people. Sometimes she notices that his behavior is unusual, not entirely clear. He is a man who does not express emotions. What kind of life he had, she does not know exactly. All she could guess was his expressionless appearance. She wasn't sure if he'd always been this cold. And to be honest, she wondered about it too. It was like he was hiding something. Perhaps the butler could tell her a little about the Duke. It might shed light on his behavior, give her more understanding. He began to talk about the Duke's childhood, how difficult it had been. It was an important revelation that could explain a lot. He noted that the Duke's childhood was harsh and full of trials. Perhaps this helped shape his personality, make him who he is. The older generations who lived in this estate knew well that Master Kang was the heir of his lineage. His position was clear, without unnecessary doubts. As a child, Kan never received the care and attention that a child in a family usually deserves. He grew up alone and without support. After the tragic loss of his parents, he was forced to go to war. He lived only to survive in these cruel conditions. Kan was a master in martial arts. He could teach how to kill a person, but he had no skills to be a normal person in society. The problem wasn't that he didn't feel emotions. It was that he simply didn't know how to express them. His feelings remained inside, hidden and repressed. Kan couldn't heal his childhood traumas. Every time he looked at his master, his heart would ache. The memories of the past were too heavy. However, after he met Anastasia, something in his soul changed. He began to feel and perceive the world differently, and this was inevitable. Over time, Kan realized that he could learn human warmth. The butler watched this process, closely noticing how the master changed. Kan knew that he could not easily trust Anastasia, but he sincerely asked her to stay with him as long as possible. He felt that he needed her. Although Kan knew it would be difficult for him to open up, he was still grateful that Anastasia was there for the Duke, helping him cope with his emotions. Despite the difficulties in relationships with men, Anastasia could not understand how to properly establish relations with the Duke so that everything would be harmonious. These thoughts had been haunting her for the last few days. When the butler offered her a book that spoke of supporting love, she pondered his words. Anastasia never expected Jack to say something like that to her. He was always reserved and did everything strictly according to the rules, but his words caught her off guard. Either way, she decided to see this through. If things didn't work out the way she planned, maybe she should just start dating the Duke. Casa advised her not to think twice and just do it. Sometimes it's important to just move forward without wasting time on doubts and let it be as it will be. Anastasia turned to him and, remaining with the man, asked how long he had been there. Her interest in this question arose quite naturally since she had not known him for so long. He smiled and replied that he had been there all along. Everything that was happening around him was part of his life, and she had to understand that. But the relationship with the Duke, it's really normal, the guy said confidently. If something was wrong, she would have noticed it by now. But for now, everything seemed quite natural. He confirmed his words, adding that if she decided not to meet with the Duke, he of course would not condemn her, although he doubted her decision. Anastasia answered doubtfully that this was not the case. She was simply not sure whether it was worth moving forward so quickly, but nevertheless decided that she needed to take the risk. The guy, unable to understand her doubts, said that it was her life, and she decided who she would date. Everything else was her choice, and he did not interfere with it. She thought that all this could have consequences, but the guy repeated that they were just dating, and there was no need to worry too much about it. Anastasia was a person who always thought too much. Sometimes her overthinking became her problem, causing her to get lost in details and doubts. Her plans were always meticulous and perfect, but even she understood that no one could be immune to unexpected turns of fate, especially in their world. Can Itan tried to calm her down, assuring her that if anything went wrong, he would take care of everything. She didn't need to worry because he would always be there to help. The lady smiled back as she listened to his words. He suggested that she simply let go of all her worries and move on, not allowing her fears to dictate her decisions. He was sure that she should at least once in her life make a choice in favor of her own happiness without succumbing to the pressure of circumstances or other people's expectations. Anastasia could not hide the fact that she was attached to the Duke. This feeling became for her a sufficient reason to step into the unknown, despite the risks. Can Itan assured her that she shouldn't worry about the consequences. Without thinking about what would happen next, she just needed to say what she felt and move forward. Anastasia thanked him for his support, promising that she would soon decide everything and take a step in the direction she had long been considering, despite her doubts. Can Itan assured her that he didn't care whether she had a lover or a husband. The most important thing for him was her happiness and confidence in her decisions without giving in to other people's views. He had made a decision long ago. He would protect this girl who had once given him an apple. It was not just a gesture, but a symbol of how much he valued her. When he was starving to death on the cold street, she came to him without thinking, handed him an apple, and suddenly his life made sense. She saved him, and it was not by chance. This relationship will not be like the one that ends after a breakup. Here everything is different, the connection is much deeper, and they do not just pass by, they remain for each other. For him, she has already become part of his family, and these are not just words. He will be with her until the end of his days, no matter what. Everything else has become unimportant. She has already become his family, and this gives him a sense of peace and confidence. For him, this is enough to live on, knowing that she is always there. He is truly happy that she has found her happiness and is grateful for it. However, deep down, he hoped that she would discuss this with Gray. He can't get rid of these thoughts. The Tojo nobles, upon seeing their master, began to apologize, raising their tails. This seemed to be a sign that the Duke was somewhat inattentive and lost in his thoughts. The Duke noticed that his master was often lost in thought. He looked thoughtful, as if something was tormenting him. Itan was clearly not in his usual form. Everything about Anastasia, from her skin to her breath, was incredibly important to him. He kept returning to these thoughts, and every moment spent with her left an imprint. The way she touched him, her arched eyebrows, all of it was imprinted in his memory. Every move she made became important and unforgettable for him. Everything felt right in her presence, and it brought him inner joy. He couldn't help but smile when he thought about how she looked and how she felt. Although this all sounds quite reasonable, he still can't quite understand what exactly this means to him. Why does his heart beat so hard next to her? At this time, Count Brill, understanding the situation, informed his nobles of the Duke's arrival. This was an important event that required due attention and preparation. He did not expect the gentleman to agree. It seemed that the Duke would refuse, but he turned out to be unexpectedly accommodating. The Duke clarified what he had just said, and the guy only answered in confusion. The Duke asked again, wondering what exactly he had agreed to. The Count explained that it was about attending noble gatherings. He thought about it, not understanding why it was necessary. The Duke asked again with displeasure, specifying that the Count had told him about this long ago. The boy, however, could not understand why he needed to go to these meetings, and began to be indignant again. The Count could not understand why his objections were so irritating. He himself had said that he liked the idea. However, the Duke reminded him that he had not spoken about such meetings, and that it was his concern. The Count asked what good had happened in his life that he had suddenly decided to do this. He could not understand what had changed and why everything looked like this now. The Duke replied coldly that it was none of his business. He clearly did not want to share the details of his life, and remained in his silent, closed world, not opening up to his interlocutor. The Count remarked that it might be connected with his personal life, perhaps because he was in love, but the Duke hastened to reply that in fact he was fine. He added in a measured tone that his desire to marry had nothing to do with emotions. If she could not accept him, all his efforts would be in vain, and everything would go wrong. The Count, hearing the Duke's words, understood that he would decide to leave it to him, having in mind the issues related to the asylum. He decided not to interfere in this matter and let the Duke do as he pleased. At that moment, he believed that the Duke had already begun to notice the hints that would lead to further action. It was obvious, but it still required time and patience. However, the gentleman said that he had not noticed anything yet, but he was sure that it would happen someday. His words were calm, but contained a hidden confidence in the future. He, if the opportunity presented itself, had to take charge of the matter himself. While the Duke had not yet made a final decision, this meant that he had to act quickly and accurately. It was strange to see the gentleman so concerned about another person, especially someone under his care. It added a new dimension to their relationship and approach to the matter. No matter how strict and decisive the Duke was, he showed incredible kindness to his beloved, which was actually very romantic. This attitude made others think. The Earl thought it would be wonderful if the Duke showed the same concern for both him and Jack. He believed that their relationship could be more open if there was more mutual respect. For himself, the Count felt that watching the Duke go through all the difficulties made him understand the importance of words and support. Even the simplest words could have a huge impact on the one who heard them. But the Duke seemed not to want to listen to these reflections. He said that if the Count wanted to hear something like that, he could find another master. This statement was direct and harsh. The Count realized that it was impossible to change the Duke's mind, and this irritated him greatly. He also could not help but notice that he wanted to know when the lady and the Duke would start dating. Just a few months ago, he was fighting on the battlefield, and now he was being crowned at a funeral. It seemed strange and almost unbelievable that he had done it so quickly. He wondered when all this had started. Perhaps from the day they had signed the contract with Anastasia. The intrigue grew in his thoughts. Maybe it happened after the first kiss, or after the night they spent together. The Duke decides to say that they met last winter. That's how it all started. The Count was surprised that he knew nothing about it. The Duke replied that it didn't matter how long they had been together. It didn't matter anyway. The Count considered this, agreeing that perhaps it didn't matter, but perhaps it did matter, and no one had yet decided how to perceive it. But if their relationship is casual without promises and commitments, it may not be quite right. It is unclear what they mean to each other. Their relationship can be vague, a little ambiguous. For example, they could just have fun without calling each other anything more serious. If she decides to meet someone else, there will be no complaints. And although the Count had nothing to say, the Duke was incredibly angry. He was not satisfied with such statements, which seemed to call his feelings into question. He said sharply that he needed to meet Anastasia immediately. Urgently. There was no longer any room for delay. These words were full of tension. The Duke left the room, and Anastasia walked in almost immediately. Her appearance was just when things were starting to get heated. The Duke sat down in his place, and the Count suddenly seemed to freeze. He was so surprised that he didn't even know what to say when he saw Anastasia. Anastasia entered with a smile, clearly about to say something to the Duke. She was about to make an important confession, which now seemed inevitable.